Hey everyone, imagine for a moment that you could travel back in time to medieval Europe. You step into the great hall of a castle, and there before you sits a king on his throne. Golden crown gleaming, velvet robes draped across his shoulders, servants bowing at his feet. The air thick with incense and the weight of absolute power. Now here's the question that's going to blow your mind tonight. Was this medieval king actually richer than Elon Musk, richer than Jeff Bezos, richer than any billionaire walking the earth today? I know what you're thinking. How could some guy from 1,000 years ago, living without electricity, without running water, without even basic medical knowledge, possibly compete with modern tech moguls worth hundreds of billions? But stick with me, because by the end of this deep dive, you're going to realize that wealth in the medieval world operated on principles so fundamentally different from today that comparing them is like trying to measure an ocean with a teaspoon. Tonight, we're going to crack open the treasure chests of history's most powerful monarchs and figure out exactly how much they'd be worth if they were alive today. We're talking about kings who controlled entire continents, who owned literal mountains of gold, who could raise armies of 100,000 men with a single decree. Kings whose spending habits would make modern billionaires look like penny-pinching accountants. But before we dive into the numbers, before we start throwing around figures that'll make your head spin, we need to understand something crucial. Medieval wealth wasn't like modern wealth. When Elon Musk is worth $200 billion, that number exists largely as digits on a computer screen. Stock prices, company valuations, market cap. These are all abstractions tied to future potential and investor confidence. If Tesla's stock price crashes tomorrow, boom, half of Musk's wealth vanishes into thin air. Medieval kings didn't have that problem. Their wealth was tangible, physical, real. They owned the land beneath your feet. They controlled the rivers you fished in, the forests you hunted, the roads you traveled. When a medieval king was wealthy, it meant he possessed actual mountains of silver, actual tons of gold, actual territories the size of modern countries. Their treasuries weren't filled with stock certificates and derivatives. They were filled with coins you could hold, jewels you could touch, artifacts you could see gleaming in the torchlight. Think about it this way. If every computer in the world shut down tomorrow, Jeff Bezos would struggle to prove he owns much of anything beyond his houses and maybe some physical Amazon warehouses. But if you transported a medieval king to today, he'd still own vast stretches of Europe, countless castles, and enough precious metals to fund small nations. His wealth was carved into the very landscape itself. Now, to understand how insanely rich these medieval monarchs really were, we need to understand how they made their money. And trust me, their methods were far more direct and ruthless than anything modern billionaires could dream of attempting. First, and most importantly, medieval kings owned land. Not just any land, but all the land. In England, after William the Conqueror seized the throne in 1066, he literally owned every single acre of the country. Every field, every forest, every village, every stream. He then parcelled out chunks of this land to his nobles in exchange for military service and loyalty, but he remained the ultimate owner. Think of it like being the landlord of an entire nation. Every farm, every town, every person living anywhere in the kingdom was essentially paying rent to the king. But land ownership was just the beginning. Medieval kings controlled trade routes like modern tech giants control internet traffic. They could slap taxes on any merchant trying to move goods through their territory. Selling wool to France, the king gets a cut. Trading silk from the east, royal tax. Moving salt from the coast to inland cities, pay the crown. These weren't gentle suggestions. These were backed by armed men who would confiscate your entire cargo if you tried to skip out on payment. Then there were the feudal obligations. Every noble in the kingdom owed the king military service, but they could also pay money instead. This system, called scutage, was basically a medieval draft dodging fee. Rich nobles who didn't want their sons dying in some foreign war could buy their way out by paying the king enormous sums. It was like having a subscription service where the product was not getting killed in battle. Medieval kings also had what we might call creative taxation methods. They could declare special levies whenever they felt like it. Building a new castle, tax the people. Going on crusade, tax the people. Daughter getting married, wedding tax. Feeling bored on a Tuesday, Tuesday tax. I'm exaggerating slightly, but not by much. Kings like John of England were notorious for inventing new taxes whenever their treasuries ran low. John created England's first income tax in 1207, and it brought in £60,000, which would be worth tens of millions today. And then there was the Jewish community, who occupied a unique and tragic position in medieval economics. Since Christians were forbidden from charging interest on loans, Jewish moneylenders filled this essential role in medieval finance. But here's the catch. They were directly under royal protection, which meant the king could tax them at will. King John once extracted £44,000 from England's Jewish community in a single year. To put that in perspective, that was nearly the entire annual budget of most kingdoms. It was basically legalized extortion on a national scale, but perhaps the most direct way medieval kings accumulated wealth was through conquest and seizure. When Henry VIII decided he didn't like the Catholic Church's influence in England, he simply took everything they owned. Between 1536 and 1540, Henry dissolved over 800 monasteries, convents, and religious houses, confiscating their land, gold, silver, and treasures. This wasn't gradual wealth building through smart investments. This was walking into the richest institutions in the country and saying, "Everything here belongs to me now." The scale of this seizure was breathtaking. The monasteries owned land worth £120,000 per year in rental income alone. That's £36 million in today's currency, and that was just the annual income from the land, not the value of the land itself, or the massive quantities of gold and silver artifacts stored in monastery treasuries. Now here's where things get really interesting. When we try to calculate what these medieval fortunes would be worth today, we run into some mind-bending numbers. Take William the Conqueror, for instance. After his conquest of England, he controlled approximately half of all land in the country directly, with the other half divided between his supporters and the church. Conservative estimates put his wealth at around $225 billion in modern terms. But that number might actually be too low. See, William didn't just own land like a modern real estate mogul. He owned people. The entire population of England, roughly 2 million souls, were essentially his economic assets. Every peasant working every field was generating wealth that flowed upward to the crown. Every merchant selling goods in every market was paying taxes that ended up in royal coffers. Every knight serving in his army was providing military service worth thousands of pounds per year. When you factor in this level of economic control, some historians argue that William's effective wealth was closer to controlling 10 to 15% of the entire economic output of medieval Europe. If we applied that same percentage to today's global economy, we'd be talking about wealth in the range of $10 to $15 trillion. That's not a typo. Trillion with a T. But William the Conqueror wasn't even close to being the richest medieval monarch. For that title, we need to travel to West Africa and meet a king whose wealth was so legendary that his name still echoes through history 600 years later. Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire in the 14th century, controlled something that no modern billionaire can claim, a near monopoly on the world's most precious resource: gold, tons and tons of gold. The Mali Empire sat atop some of the richest gold deposits on Earth. During Musa's reign, his territories produced more than half of the world's gold supply. Not half of Africa's gold, half of the entire world's gold. Imagine if one person controlled half of all the oil in the world, or half of all the computer chips, or half of all the wheat. That's the level of resource dominance we're talking about. But Mansa Musa didn't just hoard his gold like some medieval dragon. In 1324, he decided to go on pilgrimage to Mecca, and this journey became one of the most famous displays of wealth in human history. His caravan included 60,000 people. 60,000. That's larger than most modern armies. He brought 12,000 slaves just to carry supplies. He had 80 camels, each carrying between 50 and 300 pounds of gold. Think about that for a moment. Each camel was carrying more gold than most people will see in their entire lifetimes. And he had 80 of them, just casually strolling across the desert like it was no big deal. When Mansa Musa reached Cairo, he was so generous with his gold that he literally crashed the local economy. He gave away so much gold to the poor, bought so many souvenirs, funded so many construction projects, that the price of gold in Egypt collapsed and didn't recover for over a decade. One man's shopping spree destabilized the currency of one of the most important trading centers in the world. Modern estimates of Mansa Musa's wealth vary wildly, partly because the scale is so incomprehensible. Conservative figures put him at around $400 billion in today's money. But some historians argue that if we account for his control over global gold supply, plus his dominance of salt trade routes, plus his taxation of trans-Saharan commerce, his effective wealth might have approached $3 trillion. $3 trillion. That's more than the gross domestic product of most modern countries. That's more than the entire market cap of Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon combined. That's wealth on a scale that simply doesn't exist in today's world, because our global economy is too diversified and regulated to allow any individual to achieve such monopolistic control. And here's the thing that really drives home how different medieval wealth was from modern wealth. When Mansa Musa died, his wealth didn't evaporate like a stock market crash. It didn't get divided among shareholders or disappear into bankruptcy proceedings. His successors inherited actual physical gold mines, actual control over trade routes, actual armies loyal to the crown. The wealth was embedded in the landscape itself, in the very structure of society. This brings us to a crucial point about medieval wealth that most people don't understand. Kings weren't just rich individuals who happened to have political power. They were rich because they had political power. Their wealth and their authority were inseparable, mutually reinforcing aspects of the same system. Consider Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, whose reign lasted 72 years and who built the most opulent palace in European history. Versailles wasn't just a house, it was a statement of power that consumed 5% of France's entire national income during its construction. 5% of everything France produced, dedicated to building one man's home. The palace had 1,400 fountains, 1,200 orange trees, and could house 10,000 people. Louis held court there with a level of ceremony that would make modern award shows look modest. Every morning, the simple act of the king getting dressed was a ritualized performance involving dozens of nobles competing for the honor of handing him his shirt. But here's what's really staggering about Louis's wealth. During the height of Versailles construction, 60% of France's royal revenue was dedicated to funding his elaborate court. 60%. That would be like a modern government spending 60% of its budget on the president's lifestyle. It's almost inconceivable in today's political climate, but for Louis, it was Tuesday. Yet even Louis, with all his absolute power and incredible wealth, faced limitations that help us understand the constraints on medieval royal fortunes. He couldn't print money out of thin air like modern governments can. He couldn't borrow against future economic growth like modern corporations. When he needed money for wars or construction projects, he had to extract it directly from his subjects through taxation or create new government positions that he could sell to wealthy individuals. This limitation actually highlights something fascinating about medieval wealth. It was simultaneously more real and more fragile than modern wealth. More real because it consisted of physical assets, actual gold, actual land, actual control over resources, but more fragile because it depended entirely on the king's ability to maintain political control. If a medieval king lost a war, he didn't just lose his stock portfolio. He lost everything. His lands were seized, his treasures confiscated, his very life often forfeit. Modern billionaires have their wealth spread across dozens of countries, hundreds of investments, complex financial instruments that can survive political upheavals, economic crashes, even wars. Medieval kings had all their eggs in one very large, very golden basket, and if that basket fell, there was no safety net, no bankruptcy protection, no insurance policy. There was just the executioner's axe. This risk factor makes the accumulation of medieval royal wealth even more impressive. Every fortune was built and maintained through constant vigilance, diplomatic skill, military prowess, and often sheer ruthlessness. Kings who showed weakness saw their treasuries empty and their kingdoms conquered. Only the most capable and cunning monarchs managed to build and preserve truly massive fortunes. Take Edward III of England, who ruled during the height of the 100 Years' War with France. Edward understood that war could be profitable if managed correctly. His campaigns in France weren't just about territorial expansion. They were business ventures designed to capture wealth and redirect it toward England. The English developed a systematic approach to wealth extraction during their French campaigns. They would capture French nobles and hold them for enormous ransoms. They would sack wealthy French cities and ship the treasure back to England. They would control lucrative trade routes and tax all commerce flowing through them. Edward's most famous captive was King John II of France, who was ransomed for 3 million gold crowns. That's roughly equivalent to $3 billion today. Imagine kidnapping the President of France and demanding $3 billion for his release. That's the scale of medieval royal finance we're dealing with. But perhaps the most sophisticated wealth generation system in medieval Europe belonged to the Plantagenet kings of England, particularly Henry II. Henry controlled an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, including England, much of France, and parts of Ireland. But rather than ruling this vast territory through brute force alone, Henry developed what we might recognize as an early form of bureaucratic capitalism. Henry established royal courts throughout his territories that generated income through fines, fees, and legal proceedings. He created a standardized currency that increased trade and made taxation more efficient. He developed a system of royal administrators who were essentially medieval civil servants, trained in law and finance rather than just warfare. Most importantly, Henry understood the value of investing royal wealth to generate more wealth. He funded the construction of roads, bridges, and ports that increased trade volume, which in turn increased tax revenue. He established royal mints that produced high-quality coins, which became trusted currency throughout Europe, generating profits through exchange rates and monetary policy. This systematic approach to wealth building allowed Henry to accumulate what historians estimate was the equivalent of $50 to $70 billion in modern terms. But unlike modern billionaires whose wealth fluctuates with market conditions, Henry's wealth grew steadily year after year because it was based on controlling the fundamental infrastructure of medieval economic life. Transportation, currency, legal systems, trade routes. These were the medieval equivalent of controlling internet infrastructure or global shipping networks today. And Henry didn't just invest in these systems, he owned them outright. This understanding of infrastructure control brings us to one of the most crucial differences between medieval and modern wealth. When we talk about someone like Bill Gates being worth over $100 billion, that wealth is largely theoretical. It exists in stock valuations, intellectual property rights, and corporate structures that could shift dramatically based on market sentiment or technological disruption. But when Henry II controlled the trade routes between England and France, that control was absolute and physical. Every merchant ship that wanted to cross the English Channel had to pay his tolls. Every wool trader moving goods from English farms to Flemish textile centres had to use his roads, his ports, his currency systems. There was no alternative infrastructure, no competing service providers, no way to bypass the king's economic stranglehold. This level of monopolistic control extended to every aspect of medieval economic life in ways that would be impossible in today's regulated markets. Imagine if one person owned all the highways in America, all the airports, all the shipping ports, and could charge whatever fees they wanted. Imagine if they also controlled the currency, the legal system, and had a private army to enforce their will. That's essentially what the most powerful medieval kings achieved within their territories. The wealth extraction mechanisms available to these monarchs were breathtaking in their scope and efficiency. Take the concept of feudal aids, which were special taxes that vassals owed their lords for specific occasions. When a king's eldest daughter got married, every noble in the kingdom owed him money to help pay for the wedding. When the king's eldest son was knighted, another round of payments. If the king himself was captured and needed to be ransomed, his subjects were legally obligated to fund his release. These weren't suggestions or requests for voluntary contributions. These were legal obligations backed by armed force. Failure to pay could result in the confiscation of lands, imprisonment, or worse. It was like having a subscription service where the product was not being invaded by the royal army. Richard the Lionheart provides a perfect example of how this system worked in practice. When Richard was captured during the Third Crusade, England faced a ransom demand of 150,000 marks of silver. That's roughly equivalent to 2 to 3 times the entire annual income of the English crown. It was an impossible sum by normal standards. But impossible wasn't in the medieval royal vocabulary. Richard's administrators implemented what was essentially a national wealth tax. They demanded 25% of all movable goods from every person in England. They confiscated gold and silver from churches. They sold government positions to the highest bidders. They emptied monastery treasuries. They even melted down royal crowns and ceremonial objects. The result? They raised the entire ransom amount in less than 2 years. England literally mortgaged itself to buy back its king, and the system worked. The wealth was there, hidden in manor houses and monastery vaults, stored in the form of livestock and grain and precious metals. The royal administration just had to be ruthless enough to extract it. This level of resource mobilization demonstrates something that modern economists struggle to quantify. Medieval kings didn't just have access to their own wealth. In times of crisis, they could effectively commandeer the entire accumulated wealth of their kingdoms. Every gold coin hoarded by a merchant, every silver cup owned by a minor noble, every valuable tapestry hanging in a parish church could be seized and converted into royal funds. Modern governments can raise taxes and issue bonds, but they can't simply walk into people's homes and take their possessions. Medieval kings could and did exactly that whenever necessity demanded. This power to mobilize societal wealth makes calculating their effective net worth almost impossible using modern metrics. But perhaps no medieval ruler better exemplifies the staggering scale of royal wealth than Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair. Philip's reign in the early 14th century showcased both the incredible wealth-generating potential of medieval monarchy and the ruthless methods required to achieve it. Philip inherited a kingdom that was already wealthy, but he transformed France into what was essentially a medieval superpower through a combination of innovative taxation, strategic warfare, and breathtaking acts of financial piracy. His annual income exceeded 800,000 livres, making him roughly 8 times wealthier than the contemporary English king. But Philip's true genius lay in his understanding that the greatest concentrations of medieval wealth existed outside the traditional royal revenue streams. The Catholic Church controlled vast territories and possessed enormous treasuries filled with centuries of accumulated donations and tithes. The Knights Templar had evolved from a military order into essentially medieval investment bankers, controlling financial networks that spanned from London to Jerusalem. Philip looked at these institutions and saw opportunity. In 1307, he launched what amounted to a coordinated financial assault on the Templars that would make modern corporate raiders look like amateur pickpockets. On Friday, October 13th, Philip's agents simultaneously arrested every Templar in France, seizing their castles, their treasuries, their documents, and their business networks. The wealth Philip confiscated from the Templars was staggering. The Order's Paris temple alone contained enough gold and silver to fund the French crown for several years. Their rural estates generated annual incomes that rivaled those of entire provinces. Their banking operations had made them creditors to kings and emperors across Europe. But Philip wasn't content with just robbing the Templars. He wanted to legitimize the theft, so he launched a propaganda campaign accusing them of heresy, corruption, and various unspeakable crimes. He tortured confessions out of Templar leaders, burned many of them at the stake, and convinced the Pope to officially dissolve the order. It was medieval corporate takeover tactics at their most brutal and effective. The total value of Templar assets that Philip absorbed into the French crown is estimated by modern historians at somewhere between $20 and $50 billion in contemporary terms. But even that massive injection of wealth wasn't enough to satisfy Philip's ambitions. He needed more revenue to fund his wars, his building projects, and his vision of French dominance in Europe. So Philip turned his attention to another wealthy institution that couldn't fight back effectively: the Jewish communities of France. In 1306, Philip ordered the expulsion of all Jews from French territory, but here's the crucial detail. They were forced to leave behind all their property and possessions. Houses, businesses, gold, silver, everything they had accumulated over generations became property of the French crown. This wasn't taxation or even conventional robbery. This was systematic ethnic cleansing, designed to transfer wealth from a vulnerable minority to the royal treasury. The financial windfall was enormous, but it also demonstrated the terrifying scope of royal power in medieval Europe. A king could literally erase entire communities and steal their accumulated wealth with nothing more than a royal decree. Philip's wealth extraction methods extended beyond outright theft into what we might recognize as early forms of monetary manipulation. He repeatedly debased the French currency, reducing the silver content of coins while maintaining their face value. This allowed him to mint more coins from the same amount of precious metal, effectively creating money out of thin air. But medieval currency debasement was far more direct than modern monetary policy. When Philip debased the currency, he was literally stealing purchasing power from every person in France who held silver coins. Their money became worth less overnight, while the royal treasury benefited from the difference. It was inflation as a form of taxation, centuries before economists had names for such concepts. The cumulative effect of all these wealth generation strategies made Philip one of the richest individuals in medieval Europe, with an estimated net worth equivalent to somewhere between $60 and $100 billion in modern terms. But more importantly, Philip demonstrated that medieval royal wealth wasn't limited by conventional economic constraints. A sufficiently ruthless and clever king could effectively loot entire sectors of society to fund his ambitions. This brings us to a crucial understanding about medieval wealth that completely changes how we should think about historical comparisons with modern billionaires. Medieval kings weren't just rich individuals operating within economic systems. They were the economic systems. They could rewrite the rules of commerce, taxation, and property ownership whenever it suited their purposes. Elon Musk can't simply declare that all Tesla competitors are illegal and confiscate their factories. Jeff Bezos can't order the expulsion of all competing retailers and seize their assets. Bill Gates can't debase the dollar to increase his personal wealth. These actions would be impossible in modern regulated economies with independent courts, constitutional protections, and international oversight. But medieval kings routinely did equivalent things within their territories. They had what economists call sovereign immunity, taken to its logical extreme. They were above the law, because they were the law. This created opportunities for wealth accumulation that simply don't exist in the modern world. Consider the case of Edward III of England during the height of the 100 Years' War. Edward understood that medieval warfare could be incredibly profitable if approached with the right business model. His campaigns in France weren't just military expeditions, they were systematic wealth extraction operations designed to transfer French gold into English coffers. Edward's armies operated like medieval private equity firms with swords. They would capture French castles and strip them of everything valuable. They would hold French nobles for enormous ransoms. They would occupy wealthy French territories and redirect all tax revenue to England. They would control strategic trade routes and charge extortionate fees for passage. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 provides a perfect example of how this system worked. After defeating the French army, Edward's forces didn't just claim victory and go home. They spent weeks methodically looting the French camp, the surrounding countryside, and the nearby city of Calais. They captured so much gold, silver, and valuable goods that it took months to transport everything back to England. But the real prize wasn't the immediate plunder. It was the long-term control of Calais, which became an English possession for over 200 years. Calais was one of the most important trading ports in medieval Europe, and controlling it meant that England could tax all commerce flowing between Northern Europe and the Mediterranean. The annual revenue from Calais alone was estimated at around £30,000, which was roughly equivalent to 15% of England's total royal income. That's like capturing a foreign city and having it generate 15% of the entire US federal budget every year for 2 centuries. Edward's total profits from his French campaigns are estimated by historians at somewhere between £3 and £5 million over the course of his reign. Adjusted for medieval purchasing power and economic scale, that's equivalent to somewhere between $50 and $100 billion in modern terms. And that was just from one series of military campaigns, not Edward's total wealth from all sources. This level of wealth extraction through warfare was only possible because medieval kings operated in a world without international law, human rights protections, or economic regulations. They could literally invade neighboring countries, steal everything valuable, and face no consequences other than potential military retaliation. The closest modern equivalent might be if a tech billionaire could launch private military campaigns against competing companies, seize their assets, and face no legal repercussions. It's unthinkable in today's world, but it was standard operating procedure for medieval royalty. But even Edward's spectacular military profits pale in comparison to the wealth accumulated by some medieval rulers through sheer territorial control and resource monopolization. The Byzantine Emperor Basil II, who ruled from 976 to 1025, controlled an empire that stretched from southern Italy to the Caucasus Mountains, encompassing some of the richest trading cities in the medieval world. Constantinople, Basil's capital, was the New York City of medieval commerce. Every luxury good flowing between Europe and Asia passed through Byzantine territory. Silk from China, spices from India, precious stones from Persia, furs from Russia. All of it was subject to Byzantine taxation and regulation. But Basil's real genius was understanding that controlling trade routes was even more profitable than controlling gold mines. Gold had to be dug out of the ground, refined, and transported. Trade goods moved themselves, and all Basil had to do was tax them as they passed through his empire. The Byzantine tax system was incredibly sophisticated for medieval standards. They had import duties, export fees, sales taxes, harbour charges, and what amounted to medieval trademark licensing for merchants who wanted to use the imperial seal on their goods. They even had luxury taxes on items like silk and precious stones. Basil's annual revenue from trade taxation alone was estimated at around 800,000 gold coins, which was more than the total annual income of most Western European kingdoms. But that was just one revenue stream among dozens. He also collected land taxes, military service fees, court fines, and tribute payments from vassal states. The cumulative wealth of the Byzantine Empire under Basil was staggering. The imperial treasury in Constantinople contained an estimated 18 million gold coins at the height of his reign. That's roughly equivalent to $30 to $40 billion in modern purchasing power, but it represents a much larger percentage of global wealth than any modern billionaire controls. To put this in perspective, if we calculated Basil's wealth as a percentage of total global economic output in the 11th century, and then applied that same percentage to today's global economy, we'd be talking about wealth in the range of $5 to $10 trillion. That's more than the gross domestic product of any modern country except the United States and China. But perhaps the most mind-bending aspect of Byzantine wealth was its stability and longevity. The Byzantine Empire maintained enormous royal treasuries for over 1,000 years. Modern billionaire fortunes tend to fluctuate dramatically over decades or even years. Tech company valuations can crash overnight. Market conditions can wipe out entire investment portfolios. But Byzantine wealth was built on controlling physical infrastructure that couldn't be disrupted by market sentiment or technological innovation. Constantinople's geographic position between Europe and Asia was a permanent advantage that generated wealth for centuries. The city's massive walls and naval defenses made it nearly impregnable, protecting the imperial treasury from military threats. This stability allowed Byzantine emperors to accumulate wealth across multiple generations in ways that modern billionaires can't match. Jeff Bezos has built Amazon over a few decades, but his wealth is tied to stock prices and market conditions that could change rapidly. Basil inherited a wealthy empire that had been accumulating treasure for centuries, and he passed an even wealthier empire to his successors. The compound effect of this generational wealth accumulation was extraordinary. By some estimates, the total wealth accumulated by the Byzantine Empire over its 1,000-year existence was equivalent to several $1 trillion in modern terms, and much of that wealth was concentrated in the hands of the emperor and his immediate family. This brings us to a fundamental question about the nature of wealth itself. When we say that Elon Musk is worth $200 billion, what do we really mean? Most of that wealth exists as stock in companies that produce electric cars and rockets. It's valuable because investors believe these companies will be profitable in the future. But when we say that a medieval emperor like Basil controlled wealth equivalent to trillions of dollars, we're talking about something completely different. That wealth consisted of actual cities, full of actual people producing actual goods and services. It was physical control over the fundamental infrastructure of civilization itself. Modern billionaires are wealthy because they own pieces of paper or digital records that represent claims on future economic activity. Medieval emperors were wealthy because they owned the economic activity itself. They controlled the ports where ships docked, the roads where merchants traveled, the markets where goods were sold, the courts where disputes were resolved. This difference becomes even more apparent when we examine the spending patterns of medieval rulers compared to modern billionaires. When Jeff Bezos builds a massive yacht or buys expensive real estate, he's making personal purchases that don't fundamentally alter the economic landscape. But when medieval rulers made major expenditures, they were literally reshaping civilization. The construction of a single royal palace could employ thousands of craftsmen for decades, create new trade networks for luxury materials, and establish new centers of political and economic power that would influence regional development for centuries. Take the example of Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor in the 13th century. Frederick controlled territories spanning from Germany to Sicily, making him one of the most powerful rulers in medieval Europe. But his true wealth wasn't just measured in gold or land. It was measured in his ability to mobilize human resources on an unprecedented scale. When Frederick decided to build his hunting lodge at Castel del Monte in southern Italy, he didn't just hire a few architects and construction workers. He commanded stone masons from across Europe, imported marble from distant quarries, brought in mathematicians and astronomers to design the building's unique octagonal structure, and employed artists to create decorative elements that combined Islamic, Byzantine, and Western European styles. The final structure wasn't just a building. It was a statement of imperial power that demonstrated Frederick's ability to command resources from across the known world. The cost of construction was estimated at around 50,000 marks of gold, which was equivalent to roughly the entire annual revenue of a major kingdom. But more importantly, Frederick's ability to build Castel del Monte demonstrated that his wealth wasn't just about money, it was about power over human civilization itself. He could command the most skilled craftsmen in Europe to abandon their other projects and work on his personal vision. He could redirect trade routes to supply his construction projects with materials from distant lands. He could essentially reshape the economic activity of entire regions to serve his personal desires. This kind of wealth-based power simply doesn't exist in the modern world. Even the richest modern billionaires have to negotiate with suppliers, compete for skilled workers, and operate within regulatory frameworks that limit their ability to commandeer societal resources. Medieval emperors like Frederick operated under no such constraints. Their wealth gave them direct command over human labour, natural resources, and technological innovation in ways that would be impossible in today's economic systems. This transformation of wealth into direct human command becomes even more staggering when we look at the daily operations of medieval royal courts. These weren't just fancy households with expensive furniture. They were economic engines that consumed resources on a scale that would make modern luxury seem quaint by comparison. Consider the court of Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis. His daily household expenses included feeding and housing not just his immediate family, but hundreds of nobles, knights, clergy, servants, entertainers, and hangers-on who made up the royal entourage. The royal kitchens at the Louvre consumed roughly 2,000 pounds of bread per day, along with entire herds of cattle, flocks of sheep, and enough wine to float a small ship. But here's where it gets really interesting. These weren't just personal expenses. Every person fed at the royal table represented a political alliance, a military obligation, or an economic relationship. When Louis fed a duke from Burgundy, he was maintaining the loyalty of an entire province. When he housed a visiting merchant from Venice, he was securing favourable trade agreements that would benefit French commerce for years. The cost of maintaining this human network was astronomical. Louis's annual household expenses were estimated at around 400,000 livres, which was roughly equivalent to maintaining a small city. But the return on investment was enormous. The political stability and economic advantages generated by royal hospitality were worth far more than the cost of all that bread and wine. This system of wealth as political power reached its ultimate expression in the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa in the 12th century. Frederick controlled territories that stretched from the North Sea to Sicily, encompassing dozens of different kingdoms, duchies, and city-states. But his true wealth wasn't measured in gold coins. It was measured in his ability to command the loyalty and resources of hundreds of lesser rulers. When Frederick called for a military campaign, he could summon armies from across Europe. Not mercenaries fighting for pay, but feudal levies who were legally obligated to serve him. The Duke of Bavaria would arrive with his cavalry. The Archbishop of Cologne would bring his infantry. The merchants of Milan would provide supplies and siege equipment. All of this military power was essentially free to Frederick because it was part of the feudal contract that bound medieval society together. The total value of military service that Frederick could command has been estimated by modern historians at around 10 million marks of silver per year. That's roughly equivalent to the entire military budget of most modern nations. But Frederick didn't have to raise taxes or issue bonds to fund this military power. It was built into the very structure of his empire. This brings us to one of the most crucial differences between medieval and modern wealth. When we calculate the net worth of someone like Warren Buffett, we're looking at his personal assets, his stocks, his real estate, his cash holdings. We're not including the assets of Berkshire Hathaway's subsidiary companies because he doesn't own those outright. But medieval kings didn't make such distinctions. The wealth of their kingdoms was their wealth. The armies of their vassals were their armies. The trade revenues of their cities were their revenues. There was no separation between personal and state assets because the king was the state. This fusion of personal and political wealth created opportunities for accumulation that boggle the modern mind. Take the case of Alfonso X of Castile in the 13th century. Alfonso controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula, but his real treasure was the tribute he extracted from the Muslim kingdoms of southern Spain. These tributary relationships weren't simple tax arrangements. They were complex systems of economic extraction that included annual payments of gold, silver, silk, spices, and luxury goods. The Emirate of Granada alone paid Alfonso an annual tribute estimated at 50,000 gold dinars, plus additional payments in kind that included Arabian horses, Moorish carpets, ivory, and precious stones. But Alfonso didn't just collect tribute. He actively managed these tributary relationships to maximize their value. He would play different Muslim rulers against each other, offering protection to one in exchange for higher payments, then switching sides when a better offer came along. It was medieval hedge fund management with armies instead of algorithms. The total value of tribute flowing into Alfonso's treasury from Muslim Spain was estimated at around 200,000 gold dinars per year. That's roughly equivalent to controlling the entire luxury goods trade of a major modern city. And it was all profit, since Alfonso's military costs were covered by his Christian vassals through feudal obligations. This kind of tribute-based wealth generation was common throughout medieval Europe, but it reached its most sophisticated form in the Norman kingdoms of Sicily. The Norman rulers who conquered Sicily in the 11th century inherited a complex multicultural economy that included Greek merchants, Arab craftsmen, Jewish financiers, and Italian farmers. Rather than imposing a single economic system, the Norman kings created what amounted to a medieval special economic zone. They allowed each community to maintain its traditional commercial practices while extracting tribute from all of them. Greek merchants paid taxes in Byzantine gold coins. Arab craftsmen paid in luxury goods. Jewish financiers paid in silver. Italian farmers paid in agricultural produce. The result was an incredibly diverse and productive revenue stream that made the Norman kings of Sicily among the wealthiest rulers in medieval Europe. Roger II of Sicily had an annual income estimated at around 600,000 gold coins, which was more than most European kingdoms generated in total revenue. But the Norman system also demonstrates another crucial aspect of medieval wealth that modern billionaires can't replicate. The Normans weren't just extracting money from existing economic activity. They were actively creating new forms of economic activity by bringing different commercial traditions together. Modern entrepreneurs like to talk about creating value through innovation, but they're usually just developing new products or services within existing market structures. The Norman kings were literally creating new market structures by forcing different economic systems to interact and adapt to each other. This wealth creation through cultural synthesis was one of the most powerful tools available to medieval rulers. By conquering territories with different economic traditions, they could combine the best aspects of each system while eliminating inefficiencies and redundancies. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his successors represents perhaps the ultimate example of this approach. The Mongols conquered territories spanning from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing Chinese agricultural systems, Persian trading networks, Russian fur trades, and Middle Eastern financial institutions. Rather than destroying these diverse economic systems, the Mongols created a unified imperial economy that allowed goods, ideas, and wealth to flow freely across the largest contiguous empire in human history. A merchant could travel from Venice to Beijing using a single currency, protected by Mongol law, staying in Mongol-operated rest stations along the way. The economic value generated by this system was unprecedented in human history. The total annual revenue of the Mongol Empire at its height has been estimated at around 50 million silver ingots, which was more than the combined wealth of all European kingdoms. But more importantly, the Mongols were collecting this revenue from economic activity that wouldn't have existed without their political unification of Eurasia. This is where medieval wealth becomes truly incomparable to modern fortunes. Jeff Bezos didn't create the internet or invent online commerce. He built Amazon within existing technological and economic frameworks. But medieval conquerors like the Mongols were literally creating new frameworks for economic activity across entire continents. The closest modern equivalent might be if someone could somehow unify all the world's different financial systems, eliminate all trade barriers, and create a single global currency. The wealth-generating potential would be enormous, but it's politically and practically impossible in today's world of sovereign nation-states and international law. Medieval rulers faced no such constraints. They could reshape entire regions through conquest, forced migration, cultural integration, and economic reorganization. The wealth they generated through these activities wasn't just personal enrichment. It was civilization building on a scale that modern individuals simply cannot achieve. This civilization building aspect of medieval wealth becomes even more apparent when we examine the great building projects of medieval kings. These weren't just expensive construction projects. They were investments in infrastructure that would generate economic returns for centuries. Consider the case of Philip Augustus of France, who ruled from 1180 to 1223. Philip's most famous project was the construction of the Louvre fortress in Paris, but that was just one part of a comprehensive urban development program that transformed Paris from a medieval town into the economic center of Northern Europe. Philip invested royal funds in building new bridges across the Seine, constructing covered markets for merchants, paving the main streets with stone, and establishing a system of public fountains that provided clean water throughout the city. These improvements weren't just civic amenities, they were economic infrastructure that attracted merchants, craftsmen, and traders from across Europe. The return on Philip's urban investment was spectacular. The tax revenue from Paris increased by over 300% during his reign, as the improved infrastructure made the city a more attractive place to do business. The royal treasury benefited directly from this increased economic activity through market taxes, bridge tolls, and merchant licensing fees. But Philip's infrastructure investments extended far beyond Paris. He funded the construction of royal roads that connected major French cities, established standardized weights and measures that facilitated trade, and created a system of royal mints that produced high-quality coins accepted throughout Europe. The total cost of Philip's infrastructure program has been estimated at around 2 million livres, which was roughly equivalent to 5 years of royal revenue. But the long-term economic benefits were enormous. French commerce flourished, tax revenues increased, and the kingdom's overall wealth grew dramatically. This kind of infrastructure-based wealth creation was only possible because medieval kings had the political authority to undertake massive public works projects without worrying about democratic approval, environmental regulations, or competing interest groups. They could simply decree that a new road would be built, conscript the necessary labor, and redirect royal resources toward the project. Modern billionaires occasionally fund infrastructure projects, but they're limited to relatively small-scale endeavors like private space programs or philanthropic initiatives. They can't reshape entire regional economies through massive public works programs because they don't have the political authority to do so. Medieval kings did have that authority, and the most successful ones used it to create wealth on a scale that dwarfs anything possible in the modern world. The infrastructure investments made by rulers like Philip Augustus continued generating economic returns for centuries after their deaths. This long-term perspective on wealth creation was one of the most sophisticated aspects of medieval royal finance. Kings understood that their true legacy wasn't the gold they accumulated, but the economic systems they created. The most successful medieval rulers were essentially early venture capitalists, investing royal resources in projects that would generate returns for future generations. The Plantagenet kings of England provide an excellent example of this long-term approach to wealth building. Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and John all contributed to the development of English common law, a legal system that facilitated commerce by providing predictable rules for contracts, property rights, and dispute resolution. The economic value of this legal infrastructure was enormous. English merchants could trade with confidence, knowing that their contracts would be enforced by royal courts. Foreign investors were willing to do business in England because they trusted the legal system to protect their interests. The kingdom's overall economic activity increased dramatically as transaction costs decreased and commercial uncertainty diminished. The Plantagenet investment in legal infrastructure generated wealth that continued flowing to the English crown for centuries. Court fees, legal fines, and licensing revenues provided a steady stream of income that was largely self-sustaining. The kings had created a system that generated wealth automatically without requiring constant royal intervention or additional investment. This principle of systematic wealth generation reached its most sophisticated expression in the Angevin Empire, which at its height included England, much of France, and parts of Ireland. The Plantagenet rulers developed what amounted to an early multinational corporation with standardized administrative procedures, unified currency systems, and integrated trade networks spanning multiple countries. The complexity of Angevin financial administration rivaled that of modern corporations. Royal administrators maintained detailed records of revenues from dozens of different sources: land rents, feudal dues, court fees, trade taxes, customs duties, and tribute payments from vassal states. They tracked expenses for military campaigns, diplomatic missions, construction projects, and court maintenance. The surviving financial records of the Angevin Empire reveal annual revenues that fluctuated between £400,000 and £800,000 sterling, depending on military activities and economic conditions. Adjusted for medieval purchasing power, that's equivalent to somewhere between $80 billion and $160 billion in modern terms. But the most impressive aspect of Angevin wealth wasn't its absolute size, it was its efficiency and sustainability. The empire generated enormous revenues while maintaining relatively low administrative costs. The feudal system provided military service and local governance essentially for free, while royal administrators focused on revenue collection and strategic planning. This efficiency was possible because medieval kings had access to human resources that modern corporations can only dream of. Feudal obligations meant that nobles provided administrative services without salary. Monastic institutions offered banking and record-keeping services in exchange for royal protection. Merchant guilds collected taxes and regulated trade in return for commercial privileges. The result was a wealth generation system that operated with minimal overhead costs while producing maximum returns. Modern corporations spend enormous amounts on salaries, benefits, regulatory compliance, and shareholder relations. Medieval kings got equivalent services through political relationships that cost them nothing beyond the occasional feast or ceremonial gift. This brings us to another crucial difference between medieval and modern wealth. Contemporary billionaires accumulate money, but medieval kings accumulated power. And power, unlike money, compounds in ways that create exponential returns over time. When a medieval king conquered a new territory, he didn't just gain access to its existing wealth. He gained the ability to reorganize its economic systems, redirect its trade flows, and integrate its resources with his existing empire. Each conquest made future conquests easier and more profitable. The Mongol Empire demonstrates this principle perfectly. Genghis Khan's early conquests in Central Asia provided the wealth and manpower necessary for larger campaigns in China and Persia. Those victories, in turn, generated the resources needed for European invasions. Each successful campaign fed into the next, creating a cycle of expansion that seemed almost unstoppable. By the height of the Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan, the system was generating wealth that no individual ruler had ever controlled. The annual tribute from China alone was estimated at over 10 million silver ingots. The trade revenues from the Silk Road provided additional millions. Tribute from Russian principalities, Persian kingdoms, and Central Asian city-states added even more to the imperial treasury. The total wealth controlled by the Mongol Empire has been estimated by some historians at over 100 billion silver ingots, which would be equivalent to several $1 trillion in modern purchasing power. But even that staggering figure understates the true scope of Mongol wealth, because it doesn't account for the empire's ability to mobilize human resources on an unprecedented scale. When Kublai Khan decided to invade Japan, he assembled a fleet of over 4,000 ships and an army of nearly 200,000 men. The logistics of this operation required coordinating resources from across the entire Mongol Empire. Chinese shipbuilders constructed the vessels. Korean farmers provided supplies. Mongol cavalry provided the core military force. Persian administrators handled the financial planning. The cost of the Japanese invasion has been estimated at around 5 million silver ingots, which was roughly equivalent to the entire annual revenue of most European kingdoms. But Kublai didn't have to raise taxes or borrow money to fund this enormous military operation. The resources were already available within the imperial system, ready to be mobilized whenever the Khan deemed it necessary. This ability to mobilize continental-scale resources for personal projects represents a form of wealth that simply doesn't exist in the modern world. Even the richest contemporary billionaires can't command the economic output of entire continents for their private purposes. The closest modern equivalent might be if someone could somehow gain control of the entire global logistics network and redirect it toward their personal goals. Imagine if Jeff Bezos could commandeer every cargo ship, every railroad, every trucking company in the world to deliver packages for Amazon. The wealth-generating potential would be enormous. But such monopolistic control is impossible under modern economic and political systems. Medieval emperors like Kublai Khan didn't just control logistics networks, they owned them outright. Every road, every bridge, every port facility in the empire was imperial property. Every merchant ship, every trading caravan, every commercial transaction was subject to imperial taxation and regulation. This comprehensive control over economic infrastructure allowed medieval rulers to extract wealth from every aspect of commercial activity within their territories. Unlike modern billionaires who profit from specific industries or market sectors, medieval kings profited from the entire economy. The sophistication of this extraction system is often underestimated by modern observers who assume that medieval societies were primitive or inefficient. In reality, the most successful medieval kingdoms developed revenue collection mechanisms that were remarkably advanced for their time. The Norman Exchequer in England, established during the reign of Henry I, created one of the world's first systematic approaches to national financial management. Royal administrators maintained detailed records of all revenues and expenditures, conducted regular audits of local officials, and developed standardized procedures for tax collection and treasury management. The Exchequer system was so effective that it continued operating with only minor modifications for over 700 years. The basic principles of Norman financial administration influenced the development of modern treasury departments, central banks, and tax collection agencies throughout the world. But the Norman system wasn't just about collecting money efficiently. It was about creating a comprehensive understanding of the kingdom's economic potential. Exchequer records tracked agricultural production, monitored trade flows, assessed population changes, and analysed the economic impact of royal policies. This information allowed Norman kings to make strategic decisions about taxation, spending, and economic development that maximise long-term wealth generation. They understood which regions were most productive, which trade routes were most profitable, and which administrative reforms would generate the highest returns. The result was a level of economic sophistication that wouldn't be matched by most European governments until the 18th century. Norman England achieved sustainable economic growth, maintained fiscal stability, and accumulated substantial treasury reserves through systematic application of financial management principles that modern economists would recognise and respect. The wealth generated by this systematic approach was substantial. By the end of Henry II's reign, the English royal treasury contained over £700,000, which was roughly equivalent to maintaining the entire kingdom's government operations for several years without any additional revenue. But more importantly, the Norman system demonstrated that medieval wealth could be both enormous and sustainable. Unlike the boom and bust cycles that characterize many modern fortunes, well-managed medieval kingdoms could maintain their wealth across multiple generations while continuing to grow their economic base. This sustainability was achieved through a combination of diversified revenue streams, conservative spending policies, and strategic investments in wealth-generating infrastructure. Norman kings understood that their role wasn't just to consume wealth, but to create systems that would continue generating wealth for their successors. The most successful medieval dynasties followed this principle for centuries, building family fortunes that lasted longer than most modern corporations. The Capetian dynasty in France accumulated wealth across 14 generations, from 987 to 1328. The Habsburg family controlled vast territories and enormous treasuries for over 600 years, from the 13th century to the 20th. These dynastic fortunes were built on the same principles that Norman England pioneered: systematic revenue collection, strategic infrastructure investment, and careful management of political relationships. But they operated on scales that dwarf anything achievable by modern individuals. The Habsburg Empire at its height controlled territories on 4 continents, with annual revenues that exceeded the gross domestic product of most modern nations. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, had access to silver mines in the Americas, gold deposits in Africa, trade networks in Asia, and agricultural estates across Europe. The wealth flowing into Charles's treasury from the Americas alone was estimated at over 2 million ducats per year, which was more than the total revenue of most European kingdoms. But American silver was just one component of Habsburg wealth. European territories provided additional millions in taxes and feudal dues. Asian trade generated enormous profits through the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade. African gold supplemented the silver flowing from Potosi and other American mines. The total wealth controlled by Charles V has been estimated by modern historians at somewhere between $200 billion and $500 billion in contemporary terms. But even those enormous figures understate the true scope of Habsburg power, because they don't account for the empire's ability to mobilize resources across multiple continents for strategic purposes. When Charles needed to finance military campaigns in Europe, he could draw on American silver. When he wanted to expand trade in Asia, he could redirect European manufactured goods through Spanish colonial networks. When he faced rebellions in one part of the empire, he could deploy military forces from other regions to suppress them. This global reach and resource flexibility gave Habsburg wealth a strategic dimension that no modern fortune can match. Contemporary billionaires may have international investments, but they can't command the loyalty of entire continents or redirect the economic output of multiple civilizations toward their personal goals. The Habsburg system also demonstrates how medieval wealth could grow through compound effects over multiple generations. Each emperor inherited not just the accumulated treasures of his predecessors, but also the infrastructure and relationships they had built. Each generation added new territories, new revenue streams, and new capabilities to the imperial system. This compound growth continued for centuries, creating wealth that increased exponentially rather than arithmetically. By the time of Philip II of Spain in the late 16th century, Habsburg revenues exceeded 10 million ducats per year, which was roughly equivalent to controlling 20 to 30% of Europe's entire economic output. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Habsburg wealth was its global integration. Unlike medieval kingdoms that were limited to regional resources, the Habsburg Empire created the world's first truly global economy. Silver mined in Peru bought silk in China. Gold from Africa purchased spices in Indonesia. European manufactured goods were traded for American agricultural products. This global integration allowed the Habsburgs to profit from economic activities on every inhabited continent. They weren't just collecting taxes from their own subjects. They were extracting wealth from global trade networks that connected civilizations around the world. The closest modern parallel might be if someone could own substantial portions of every major corporation, control significant percentages of every national economy, and collect fees from every international transaction. The wealth-generating potential would be unlimited, but such comprehensive global control is impossible under current political and economic systems. Medieval empires like the Habsburg domains achieved exactly this kind of global economic control through military conquest, political alliance, and strategic marriage. They created wealth generation systems that operated on a planetary scale, with resources and revenues flowing between continents as easily as money moves between bank accounts today. This global perspective on wealth accumulation represents perhaps the greatest difference between medieval and modern fortunes. Contemporary billionaires are limited by national borders, international law, and economic regulations that prevent any individual from achieving monopolistic control over global resources. Medieval emperors faced no such limitations. They could conquer entire continents, redirect global trade flows, and command the economic output of multiple civilizations. Their wealth wasn't just personal enrichment, it was planetary dominance on a scale that no modern individual can even imagine, let alone achieve. The implications of this difference extend far beyond simple numerical comparisons of net worth. Medieval rulers possessed a form of wealth that was qualitatively different from anything that exists in the contemporary world. They had wealth that could reshape civilizations, redirect the course of human history, and determine the fate of entire continents. When we ask whether a medieval king would be richer than a modern billionaire, we're not really asking about money. We're asking about power, influence, and the ability to shape the world according to personal vision. And by those measures, the greatest medieval rulers possessed wealth that no contemporary individual can match, regardless of how many billions of dollars they might control. This transformation of wealth into direct command over civilization itself becomes even more staggering when we examine how medieval kings could literally redirect the flow of human history through their personal spending decisions. Unlike modern billionaires who invest in companies or purchase luxury goods, medieval rulers had the power to reshape entire cultures, religions, and technologies simply by choosing where to allocate their resources. Take the case of Alfonso X of Castile, known as Alfonso the Wise, who ruled in the 13th century. Alfonso's annual income exceeded 200,000 maravedis, making him one of the wealthiest rulers in Europe. But Alfonso didn't just hoard this wealth or spend it on personal luxuries. He invested royal funds in what we would recognize today as the world's first comprehensive research and development program. Alfonso established the School of Translators in Toledo, where scholars from across Europe, Africa, and Asia worked together to translate ancient Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew texts into Latin and vernacular languages. This wasn't just academic curiosity. It was a strategic investment in knowledge that would pay dividends for centuries. The king funded teams of mathematicians, astronomers, philosophers, and scientists who produced groundbreaking works in multiple fields. The Alphonsine tables, created under his patronage, became the standard astronomical reference throughout Europe for over 3 centuries. His legal code, the Siete Partidas, influenced jurisprudence across the Western world. The total cost of Alfonso's intellectual investments has been estimated at around 50,000 maravedis per year, which was roughly equivalent to maintaining a standing army of 5,000 men. But the long-term impact was immeasurable. The knowledge preserved and created in Alfonso's Toledo became the foundation for the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and ultimately the modern world. This is the kind of civilization-shaping investment that no modern billionaire can replicate. Even the richest contemporary individuals are limited to funding specific research projects or educational institutions within existing academic frameworks. They can't single-handedly preserve entire bodies of human knowledge or redirect the intellectual development of multiple cultures. Alfonso's intellectual empire demonstrates another crucial aspect of medieval wealth that modern observers often miss. Kings weren't just collecting money for personal enjoyment. They were accumulating resources that could be deployed to solve civilizational challenges on a scale that individual wealth simply cannot achieve today. Consider the problem of preserving human knowledge in an age before printing presses, when every book had to be copied by hand. This was an enormously expensive undertaking that required coordinating the efforts of hundreds of scribes, translators, and scholars across multiple countries and cultures. Only someone with Alfonso's level of wealth and political authority could organize such a massive intellectual project. He could command the services of the best scholars in Europe, Africa, and Asia. He could provide them with secure working conditions, extensive libraries, and unlimited access to rare manuscripts. He could guarantee their safety while they worked with potentially controversial religious and philosophical texts. The result was an explosion of intellectual activity that preserved classical knowledge, advanced scientific understanding, and laid the groundwork for future cultural development. But this achievement was only possible because Alfonso possessed the kind of comprehensive wealth that allowed him to treat entire fields of human knowledge as personal investment opportunities. Modern technology billionaires like to talk about changing the world through innovation, but their efforts are necessarily focused on specific industries or market sectors. Alfonso was literally preserving and advancing the entire intellectual heritage of human civilization. His investment returns weren't measured in dollars, but in the accumulated knowledge that would benefit humanity for centuries. This brings us to one of the most profound differences between medieval and modern wealth. Contemporary fortunes are typically built by exploiting existing economic systems more efficiently than competitors. Medieval royal wealth was often created by building entirely new economic systems from scratch. The crusading kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean provide perhaps the most dramatic example of this wealth creation through system building. When European knights conquered Jerusalem and other Middle Eastern cities during the First Crusade, they didn't just seize existing treasures. They created hybrid economic systems that combined Western feudalism with Eastern commercial practices. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, established in 1099, became one of the wealthiest states in the medieval world by integrating European military organization with Middle Eastern trade networks. Crusader kings controlled the lucrative spice routes connecting Asia with Europe, while also managing agricultural estates worked by local populations using traditional Middle Eastern farming techniques. This economic fusion generated enormous wealth for the Crusader nobility. The annual revenue of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was estimated at around 400,000 bezants, which was comparable to the income of major European kingdoms despite controlling a much smaller territory. But the real innovation of the Crusader kingdoms was their development of international banking systems that allowed wealth to flow efficiently between Europe and the Middle East. The Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller created what amounted to medieval multinational corporations, with operations spanning from London to Jerusalem. These military banking orders could transfer enormous sums of money across thousands of miles without physically moving gold or silver. A merchant could deposit funds with the Templars in Paris and withdraw equivalent amounts from their Jerusalem treasury, minus a modest service fee. The scale of these operations was staggering. The Templars alone were handling financial transactions worth millions of pounds per year by the 13th century. Their annual income from banking operations exceeded the revenues of most European kingdoms. But more importantly, the Crusader banking system created new forms of wealth that hadn't existed before. They weren't just moving existing money more efficiently. They were creating credit, managing international exchange rates, and developing financial instruments that increased the total amount of wealth circulating in the medieval economy. This wealth creation through financial innovation demonstrates another way that medieval rulers could accumulate fortunes that dwarf modern billionaire wealth. They weren't limited to competing within existing markets. They could literally create new markets and new forms of value. The closest modern equivalent might be the creation of cryptocurrency markets, which have generated enormous wealth by establishing entirely new categories of financial assets. But even the most successful cryptocurrency entrepreneurs are working within existing technological and regulatory frameworks. Medieval Crusader kings were creating financial systems in territories where no such frameworks had previously existed. They were combining different monetary systems, legal traditions, and commercial practices to generate forms of wealth that no single culture had previously imagined. The Ayyubid Sultan Saladin, who reconquered Jerusalem from the Crusaders, provides an excellent example of how medieval rulers could accumulate wealth by mastering these complex international systems. Saladin understood that controlling Middle Eastern trade routes was more valuable than simply conquering territory. When Saladin retook Jerusalem in 1187, he didn't destroy the international banking networks that the Crusaders had established. Instead, he co-opted them, allowing European merchants and banking orders to continue operating under his protection in exchange for substantial tribute payments. This pragmatic approach to wealth extraction generated enormous revenues for Saladin's treasury. European merchants were willing to pay premium fees for access to Asian markets, and Saladin was happy to provide that access as long as he received his share of the profits. The annual tribute flowing into Saladin's treasury from European commercial operations was estimated at around 200,000 dinars, which was roughly equivalent to the entire tax revenue of a major European kingdom. But this was essentially free money, since Saladin didn't have to invest in creating or maintaining the commercial infrastructure that generated it. Saladin's approach demonstrates another sophisticated aspect of medieval wealth accumulation. The most successful rulers understood that destroying existing economic systems was often less profitable than capturing and redirecting them. This principle of economic capture rather than economic destruction became one of the most powerful tools available to medieval conquerors. Rather than simply looting conquered territories and moving on, smart rulers would study existing commercial practices and figure out how to insert themselves into established wealth generation systems. The Mongol Empire represents the ultimate expression of this approach. When Mongol armies conquered new territories, they made systematic efforts to preserve and enhance existing economic infrastructure. They protected merchant networks, maintained trade routes, and encouraged commercial activity by providing security and standardized regulations. The result was an explosion of economic activity across the Mongol Empire that generated wealth on an unprecedented scale. The annual revenue flowing into the imperial treasury from trade taxes alone exceeded 10 million silver ingots, which was more than the combined wealth of all European kingdoms. But the Mongols weren't just taxing existing trade. They were actively creating new commercial opportunities by connecting previously isolated markets. Chinese silk could now be sold directly in European markets. Persian carpets could be traded for Russian furs. Indian spices could be exchanged for Mongolian horses. This market integration created enormous value that hadn't existed before the Mongol conquests. The empire wasn't just redistributing existing wealth, it was generating new wealth by making economic exchanges possible that had been impossible under previous political arrangements. The total economic value created by Mongol market integration has been estimated by modern economists at several $1 trillion in contemporary terms. But this wealth wasn't just theoretical. It was realized through actual commercial transactions that enriched merchants, craftsmen, and consumers across 3 continents. The Mongol Khans captured a significant percentage of this wealth through taxation and tribute, making them arguably the richest individuals in human history. But their wealth was fundamentally different from modern billionaire fortunes, because it was based on creating and controlling entire economic ecosystems, rather than simply owning shares in existing companies. This ecosystem-based approach to wealth accumulation reached its most sophisticated expression in the maritime empires of the later medieval period. The Venetian Republic, while not technically a monarchy, developed wealth generation systems that were later adopted by royal houses across Europe. Venice controlled Mediterranean trade routes through a combination of naval power, diplomatic skill, and commercial innovation. But the Venetians didn't just tax existing trade. They actively created new forms of commercial activity by developing advanced shipbuilding techniques, navigation methods, and financial instruments. The Venetian arsenal became the world's first industrial production facility, capable of building a complete warship in a single day. This manufacturing capability allowed Venice to maintain naval supremacy while also generating enormous profits from ship sales to other maritime powers. The annual revenue of the Venetian Republic at its height exceeded 1 million ducats, which was comparable to the income of major European kingdoms. But Venice achieved this wealth with a population of only about 200,000 people, making it one of the most economically efficient political entities in medieval history. The Venetian system was so successful that it influenced the development of royal wealth generation strategies across Europe. Kings began investing in shipbuilding, navigation, and maritime commerce as ways of supplementing their traditional land-based revenues. Henry V of England provides an excellent example of how medieval kings adapted Venetian innovations to royal wealth accumulation. Henry invested royal funds in developing English shipbuilding capabilities, establishing naval bases, and training merchant marines. These investments paid enormous dividends during Henry's French campaigns. English naval superiority allowed him to control the English Channel, cutting off French trade routes while protecting English commercial vessels. The economic impact of this naval control was worth millions of pounds in today's currency. But Henry's naval investments also generated wealth through more direct means. English ships captured hundreds of French merchant vessels during the war, confiscating cargoes worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. The royal treasury received a percentage of all prize money, creating a steady stream of income from naval warfare. Henry's total profits from naval operations during his French campaigns have been estimated at around £300,000, which was roughly equivalent to 3 years of normal royal revenue. But more importantly, Henry's naval investments established England as a major maritime power, creating wealth generation capabilities that would benefit his successors for centuries. This long-term approach to naval investment demonstrates another way that medieval royal wealth differed from modern billionaire fortunes. Contemporary wealthy individuals typically focus on short-term returns and quarterly profits. Medieval kings could make strategic investments that wouldn't pay off for decades because they were building dynastic wealth rather than personal portfolios. The Portuguese royal house provides perhaps the best example of this long-term approach to wealth building through maritime investment. Beginning with Prince Henry the Navigator in the 15th century, Portuguese kings invested enormous royal resources in developing oceanic exploration capabilities. These investments were incredibly expensive and produced no immediate returns. Prince Henry spent decades funding expeditions that seemed to accomplish nothing more than mapping empty stretches of African coastline. Contemporary observers thought he was wasting royal resources on pointless adventures. But Henry understood that controlling oceanic trade routes would eventually generate wealth that dwarfed the costs of exploration. When Portuguese navigators finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached Asian markets, the return on Henry's investments was spectacular. The annual revenue flowing into the Portuguese royal treasury from Asian trade exceeded 2 million cruzados by the early 16th century. That was roughly equivalent to the combined income of several major European kingdoms, generated by a country with a population of less than 1 million people. But the Portuguese maritime empire demonstrates another crucial aspect of medieval wealth that modern billionaires cannot replicate. Henry's investments weren't just about making money. They were about reshaping the fundamental structure of global commerce. Before Portuguese maritime expansion, Asian goods reached European markets through complex overland routes controlled by Middle Eastern merchants. These routes were expensive, dangerous, and subject to political disruption. European consumers paid enormous markups for Asian spices, silk, and precious stones. Portuguese sea routes eliminated these middlemen and dramatically reduced the cost of Asian goods in European markets. This wasn't just good business. It was a transformation of global economic relationships that affected millions of people across 3 continents. The wealth generated by this transformation flowed primarily to the Portuguese crown, making Portuguese kings among the richest rulers in European history. But their wealth was based on controlling fundamental changes in how global commerce operated, not just on owning shares in existing commercial enterprises. Modern billionaires can disrupt specific industries or create new products, but they can't single-handedly reshape global economic relationships in the way that Portuguese maritime expansion did. The political and regulatory constraints of the contemporary world prevent any individual from achieving such comprehensive control over international commerce. Medieval kings faced no such constraints. They could redirect global trade flows, establish new commercial relationships, and create entirely new forms of economic activity simply by exercising their royal authority effectively. The Spanish conquest of the Americas represents perhaps the most dramatic example of medieval-style wealth creation through comprehensive economic transformation. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the New World, they didn't just discover existing treasures. They created entirely new economic systems that generated wealth on an unprecedented scale. The silver mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia became the single most valuable economic asset in human history. At their peak, these mines produced over 200 tons of silver per year, which was roughly equivalent to tripling the global silver supply overnight. The wealth flowing from American silver mines into the Spanish royal treasury was staggering. Annual revenues exceeded 8 million pesos, which was more than the combined income of all other European kingdoms. Spanish kings suddenly found themselves controlling more liquid wealth than had ever existed in human history. But American silver wasn't just valuable in itself. It transformed global economic relationships by providing a universally accepted medium of exchange that could facilitate trade between previously isolated markets. Chinese merchants would accept Spanish silver in exchange for silk and porcelain. Indian craftsmen would trade spices and textiles for American silver. European manufacturers could purchase raw materials from around the world using silver coins minted in Mexico. This global integration created enormous economic value that benefited everyone involved in international trade. But the Spanish crown captured a significant percentage of this value through taxation, tribute, and direct ownership of mining operations. The total wealth controlled by Spanish kings during the height of American silver production has been estimated at several $100 billion in contemporary terms. But even that enormous figure understates the true scope of Spanish economic power, because it doesn't account for the empire's ability to influence global commerce through monetary policy. When Spanish kings decided to increase silver production, they could flood global markets with new money, creating inflation that benefited debtors while harming creditors. When they restricted silver exports, they could create deflationary pressures that had the opposite effect. This level of monetary control gave Spanish rulers a form of economic power that no modern individual possesses. Even the wealthiest contemporary billionaires can't single-handedly influence global monetary conditions or redirect international trade flows through their personal decisions. Federal Reserve chairmen and central bank governors have some ability to influence monetary policy, but they operate within complex institutional frameworks that limit their personal authority. Spanish kings controlling American silver mines could make monetary decisions that affected the entire global economy without consulting anyone or following any rules beyond their own judgment. The economic historian Earl Hamilton calculated that Spanish control of American silver production allowed the Habsburg monarchs to influence global price levels for over 2 centuries. This wasn't just wealth in the conventional sense. It was the power to determine the relative value of money itself. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Spanish-American wealth was its sustainability and growth potential. Unlike medieval kingdoms that were limited by fixed agricultural resources, American territories offered seemingly unlimited opportunities for expansion and development. Spanish explorers continued discovering new silver deposits, new gold mines, and new territories throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Each discovery added to the crown's wealth while also creating new opportunities for future expansion. The compound growth of Spanish-American wealth was extraordinary. Annual silver production increased from virtually nothing in 1500 to over 400 tons per year by 1600. This hundredfold increase in production generated proportional increases in royal revenues and Spanish economic power. Modern technology companies sometimes achieve rapid growth rates, but they're constrained by market saturation, competitive pressures, and regulatory limitations. Spanish-American territories faced no such constraints. There were always new lands to explore, new resources to exploit, and new populations to incorporate into the imperial system. This unlimited growth potential gave Spanish kings a form of wealth that was qualitatively different from anything available to modern individuals. They weren't just accumulating money within existing economic systems. They were creating new economic systems that could expand indefinitely. The psychological and cultural impact of this unlimited wealth was profound. Spanish kings began thinking of themselves not just as European rulers, but as global emperors with dominion over multiple continents. They commissioned palaces that dwarfed anything previously built in Europe. They funded artistic and architectural projects that were designed to showcase their unprecedented wealth to the entire world. The Escorial Palace, built by Philip II in the late 16th century, consumed over 5 million ducats during its construction. That was roughly equivalent to the entire annual revenue of most European kingdoms, spent on a single building project. But the Escorial wasn't just a palace. It was a statement of imperial power that demonstrated Spain's ability to mobilize resources on a scale that no other European power could match. The building combined royal residence, monastery, library, and mausoleum into a single complex that showcased Spanish control over global wealth. The palace contained over 2,200 doors, 2,600 windows, and 86 staircases. Its library held over 40,000 books and manuscripts, making it one of the largest collections of human knowledge in the world. Its art collection included works by the greatest masters of European painting. But perhaps most impressively, the Escorial was built entirely with American wealth. Every stone was quarried using silver-funded labor. Every artistic commission was paid for with gold from New World mines. Every architectural innovation was made possible by the unlimited resources flowing from Spanish-American territories. This comprehensive integration of global resources into royal building projects demonstrates another way that medieval wealth differed from modern billionaire fortunes. When contemporary wealthy individuals build expensive homes or commission major artworks, they're making personal purchases that don't fundamentally alter global economic relationships. But when Spanish kings built palaces like the Escorial, they were demonstrating their ability to redirect global resource flows toward their personal vision. They were showing the world that they could command the economic output of entire continents for their private purposes. The cultural impact of such demonstrations was enormous. Other European rulers felt compelled to compete with Spanish magnificence, leading to an arms race in royal luxury that transformed European court culture. The Palace of Versailles, built by Louis XIV, was essentially a French attempt to match Spanish imperial grandeur. But Louis faced a crucial disadvantage in this competition. France didn't control American silver mines, so French royal wealth was limited by European agricultural and commercial resources. Louis had to extract wealth from his existing subjects, rather than tapping into new global resource streams. This limitation forced Louis to develop more sophisticated wealth extraction techniques than his Spanish counterparts needed. French royal administrators became experts at maximizing tax revenues, developing new forms of government borrowing, and creating innovative sources of royal income. The French system of tax farming, for example, allowed the crown to receive immediate cash payments in exchange for granting private individuals the right to collect specific taxes. This system generated instant liquidity for royal projects, while transferring the risks and costs of tax collection to private entrepreneurs. Louis also pioneered the sale of government offices as a way of raising royal revenue. Wealthy French citizens could purchase positions in the royal bureaucracy, judicial system, or military hierarchy. These offices provided social status and modest salaries, while generating substantial immediate income for the royal treasury. The total revenue generated by office sales during Louis's reign exceeded 10 million livres, which was roughly equivalent to several years of normal tax income. But more importantly, office sales created a class of wealthy individuals who had direct financial stakes in the success of the royal government. This alignment of private wealth with royal interests was a sophisticated form of political financing that modern governments still use in modified forms. Louis was essentially selling shares in the French monarchy to wealthy investors, creating a stakeholder class that would support royal policies because their personal fortunes depended on royal success. The psychological genius of this system was that it transformed potential opponents of royal power into active supporters. Wealthy merchants and lawyers who might otherwise have criticized royal taxation became enthusiastic defenders of royal authority because they had purchased positions within the royal system. But Louis's most innovative approach to wealth generation was his development of what we might recognize as early forms of luxury branding. Versailles wasn't just a palace. It was a showcase for French craftsmanship, artistry, and cultural sophistication that created international demand for French luxury goods. Foreign nobles who visited Versailles returned home wanting French furniture, French fashions, French wines, and French artistic styles. This cultural influence generated enormous economic benefits for French manufacturers and merchants, who could charge premium prices for goods associated with French royal taste. The annual export revenue generated by French luxury goods during Louis's reign exceeded 5 million livres, much of which was captured by the royal treasury through various taxes and fees. Louis had essentially created the world's first national luxury brand, with himself as the chief marketing executive. This cultural approach to wealth generation was remarkably sophisticated for the 17th century. Lewis understood that controlling cultural trends could be just as profitable as controlling trade routes or natural resources. He invested royal funds in developing French artistic and cultural capabilities that would generate economic returns for generations. The long-term impact of Louis's cultural investments was extraordinary. French became the international language of diplomacy and high culture. French artistic styles influenced architecture and design throughout Europe. French fashion set global trends in clothing and luxury goods. These cultural exports generated wealth for France that continued flowing long after Louis's death. French cultural influence created permanent market advantages for French producers that couldn't be eliminated by military defeat or political changes. Modern countries still try to develop cultural soft power as a way of generating economic benefits, but they operate within competitive international systems where multiple nations are pursuing similar strategies. Louis was creating French cultural dominance in an era when no other European power understood the economic potential of systematic cultural influence. This first-mover advantage in cultural branding gave Louis a form of wealth generation capability that no modern individual can replicate. Contemporary billionaires can influence cultural trends within specific market segments, but they can't single-handedly establish their personal taste as the global standard for luxury and sophistication. The combination of Louis's various wealth generation innovations made him one of the richest individuals in European history, with an estimated net worth equivalent to somewhere between $100 and $200 billion in contemporary terms. But more importantly, Louis demonstrated that medieval royal wealth could be both enormous and sophisticated, combining traditional resource extraction with innovative approaches to economic development. This sophistication challenges common assumptions about medieval economic systems. Modern observers often assume that medieval wealth was primitive or unsustainable, based on simple resource extraction rather than complex value creation. But rulers like Louis, Philip of Spain, and Alfonso of Castile developed wealth generation systems that were remarkably advanced for their time. They understood concepts like market integration, cultural branding, financial innovation, and long-term strategic investment that modern economists consider sophisticated tools of contemporary capitalism. The difference between medieval and modern wealth wasn't sophistication, it was scope. Medieval kings could apply sophisticated economic strategies across entire continents with virtually unlimited political authority. Modern billionaires must operate within much more constrained political and regulatory environments. This brings us to a crucial question about the nature of wealth itself. When we compare medieval royal fortunes with modern billionaire wealth, are we really comparing equivalent phenomena? Or are we trying to measure fundamentally different forms of economic power using inappropriate metrics? Medieval kings controlled comprehensive economic ecosystems that included land, labor, natural resources, trade networks, and political authority. Their wealth was embedded in the fundamental structure of civilization itself. Modern billionaires own financial assets that represent claims on future economic activity, but they don't control the underlying systems that generate that activity. This difference becomes particularly apparent when we consider what happens during economic crises. When modern financial markets crash, billionaire fortunes can evaporate overnight as stock prices collapse and asset values plummet. The wealth exists primarily as abstract valuations that can change dramatically based on investor sentiment. But when medieval kingdoms faced economic crises, royal wealth was much more resilient. Kings still owned their land, controlled their armies, and commanded the loyalty of their subjects. The fundamental sources of royal power and wealth remained intact even during periods of political or economic disruption. The Black Death pandemic of the 14th century provides an excellent example of this resilience. The plague killed roughly 1/3 of Europe's population, causing massive economic disruption and social upheaval. Agricultural production collapsed. Trade networks broke down. Entire cities were abandoned. Yet most European kingdoms emerged from the plague years with their royal wealth intact, or even enhanced. The reduced population meant that surviving peasants had access to more land and resources, making them more productive and able to pay higher taxes. Labour shortages drove up wages, increasing the tax base for royal revenues. Kings like Edward III of England actually became wealthier during the plague years, as reduced population pressure allowed for more intensive agricultural development and higher per capita tax collection. Edward's annual income increased by over 30% between 1350 and 1360, despite the massive population losses. This ability to maintain and even increase wealth during periods of crisis demonstrates the fundamental stability of medieval royal fortunes. They were based on controlling physical resources and political systems that couldn't be eliminated by financial market volatility or investor panic. Modern billionaire wealth lacks this crisis resilience. During the 2008 financial crisis, many of the world's wealthiest individuals saw their net worth decline by 50% or more within a matter of months. Their wealth existed primarily as financial assets that were vulnerable to market sentiment and regulatory changes. Medieval kings didn't face such vulnerabilities. Their wealth was integrated into the basic structure of society in ways that made it almost impossible to eliminate through purely financial mechanisms. You could kill a king and seize his treasury, but you couldn't make his kingdom worthless through market manipulation or regulatory changes. This stability was both a strength and a limitation of medieval royal wealth. Kings were protected from financial market volatility, but they were also constrained by the physical limitations of their territories and populations. They couldn't achieve the rapid wealth growth that modern entrepreneurs sometimes achieve through technological innovation or global market expansion. The rise and fall of medieval royal fortunes typically played out over generations rather than years. A successful king might double his kingdom's wealth during a long reign, but he couldn't achieve the thousand-fold increases in net worth that modern tech entrepreneurs sometimes experience during rapid company growth. This slower pace of wealth accumulation was offset by greater permanence and intergenerational stability. Medieval royal dynasties could maintain enormous wealth across centuries, while modern billionaire families often see their fortunes dissipate within a few generations due to inheritance taxes, business failures, or simple mismanagement. The Capetian dynasty in France provides an excellent example of this long-term wealth accumulation. From Hugh Capet's coronation in 987 to the death of Charles IV in 1328, 14 generations of Capetian kings steadily expanded French royal wealth through territorial conquest, administrative innovation, and strategic marriage alliances. Each king inherited not just his predecessor's accumulated treasure, but also the infrastructure, relationships, and institutional knowledge that enabled continued wealth growth. The compound effect of this generational accumulation was extraordinary, transforming France from a relatively minor European kingdom into the wealthiest and most powerful nation on the continent. By the end of the Capetian period, French royal wealth was estimated at over 15 million livres, which represented roughly 10 to 15% of France's entire economic output. No modern billionaire controls such a large percentage of any major nation's total wealth, because contemporary economies are too large and diversified to allow such concentration. The Capetian achievement demonstrates another crucial difference between medieval and modern wealth. Contemporary billionaires are typically first-generation entrepreneurs who build personal fortunes during their lifetimes. Medieval royal wealth was usually the product of centuries of systematic accumulation by multiple generations working toward common dynastic goals. This multi-generational approach to wealth building allowed medieval dynasties to undertake projects that would be impossible for individual entrepreneurs. The construction of major cathedrals, for example, often required sustained financial support across multiple centuries. The Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris was begun under Louis VII in 1163 and wasn't completed until 1345, nearly 200 years later. The total cost of construction exceeded 2 million livres, spread across the reigns of 14 different kings. No single ruler could have afforded such an expenditure, but the Capetian dynasty could maintain consistent funding across multiple generations. These cathedral projects weren't just religious expressions. They were strategic investments in urban development, architectural innovation, and cultural prestige that generated economic returns for centuries. Notre Dame became a pilgrimage destination that attracted visitors from across Europe, generating substantial revenue for Parisian merchants and royal tax collectors. The cathedral also served as a centre for education, banking, and legal services that enhanced Paris's position as a commercial hub. The economic benefits of cathedral construction far exceeded the costs, but only because medieval kings could take multi-generational approaches to major investments. Modern billionaires occasionally fund large-scale philanthropic projects, but they're constrained by human lifespans and tax regulations that make multi-generational wealth accumulation difficult. They can't maintain consistent funding for centuries-long projects because their wealth typically doesn't survive intact across multiple generations. This limitation affects not just the scale of projects that modern wealthy individuals can undertake, but also their approach to wealth deployment. Contemporary billionaires tend to focus on projects that can be completed within their lifetimes, while medieval kings could pursue goals that wouldn't be achieved for generations. The Reconquista in Spain provides perhaps the most dramatic example of multi-generational royal wealth deployment. The Christian kingdoms of northern Spain spent over 7 centuries systematically conquering territory from Muslim rulers, finally completing the process in 1492 with the fall of Granada. This wasn't a single military campaign funded by one ruler. It was a sustained effort that required consistent financial support from dozens of kings across multiple dynasties. Each generation inherited both the accumulated resources and the strategic objectives of their predecessors, creating a compound effect that eventually achieved total success. The total cost of the Reconquista has been estimated at over 50 million maravedis, spread across 7 centuries of warfare, castle construction, population resettlement, and administrative development. No single king could have afforded such an expenditure, but the collective wealth of Spanish royal dynasties made it possible. The economic returns from the Reconquista were enormous. The conquered territories included some of the most fertile agricultural land in Europe, major trading cities like Seville and Córdoba, and access to African gold trade routes. The annual revenue generated by these acquisitions exceeded 2 million maravedis, making Spanish kings among the wealthiest rulers in medieval Europe. But the Reconquista also demonstrates the transformative power of sustained royal investment across generations. The conquered territories didn't just add to Spanish royal wealth, they fundamentally altered the economic structure of the entire Iberian Peninsula. The integration of former Muslim territories into Christian kingdoms created new forms of agricultural production, urban development, and commercial activity. Spanish kings didn't just inherit existing wealth from conquered cities, they actively developed new wealth generation systems that combined Christian administrative practices with Islamic technological innovations. The irrigation systems of Andalusia, for example, were maintained and expanded under Christian rule, creating agricultural productivity that exceeded anything achieved in Northern Europe. The annual agricultural revenue from reconquered territories was estimated at over 500,000 maravedis, making agriculture a more important source of royal wealth than traditional feudal dues. But the Reconquista also illustrates the risks inherent in multi-generational wealth accumulation strategies. Several Spanish royal dynasties exhausted their treasuries financing military campaigns that produced no immediate returns. The Kingdom of Leon nearly went bankrupt in the 12th century after a series of unsuccessful sieges that consumed decades of accumulated royal wealth. These failures demonstrate that medieval royal wealth despite its apparent stability, was always vulnerable to strategic miscalculations that could wipe out generations of careful accumulation. Kings who made poor military or diplomatic decisions could lose everything, regardless of how much wealth their predecessors had built up. The complexity of managing multi-generational royal wealth led to the development of increasingly sophisticated administrative systems. By the 13th century, major European kingdoms employed hundreds of professional administrators, accountants, and financial specialists who managed royal revenues with remarkable efficiency. The English exchequer, which we discussed earlier, evolved into essentially a medieval treasury department that tracked revenues from dozens of different sources, managed complex international loans, and maintained detailed records of royal expenditures. The surviving pipe rolls from Henry II's reign show annual revenues broken down by county type of tax and collection method with accuracy that rivals modern government accounting. This administrative sophistication allowed medieval kings to optimize their wealth generation strategies in ways that weren't possible in earlier periods. They could identify which territories were most profitable, which taxes generated the highest returns, and which expenditures produced the best long-term benefits. Henry III of England provides an excellent example of how sophisticated royal financial management could maximize wealth accumulation. Henry's administrators conducted regular audits of royal revenues, identified inefficiencies in tax collection, and implemented reforms that increased annual income by over 40% during his reign. Henry also pioneered the use of professional tax collectors who were paid commissions based on the amounts they collected. This incentive system ensured that royal revenues were maximized while reducing the administrative burden on the royal household. The system was so effective that it was copied by kingdoms throughout Europe, but perhaps Henry's most innovative contribution to royal wealth management was his development of what we might recognize as early forms of deficit financing. When royal expenditures exceeded current revenues, Henry would borrow against future tax income, using Italian banking houses that specialized in international lending. These loans allowed Henry to undertake major projects and military campaigns without waiting for tax revenues to accumulate. The interest rates were high, typically 15 to 20% per year, but the economic returns from royal investments often exceeded the borrowing costs. Henry's total borrowing during his reign exceeded £200,000, which was roughly equivalent to 4 years of normal royal revenue. But the projects funded by this borrowing, including castle construction, urban development, and military campaigns, generated increased tax revenues that more than covered the debt service. This sophisticated approach to royal finance demonstrates that medieval wealth management could be remarkably advanced when kings had access to professional administrators and international financial markets. Henry's borrowing strategies wouldn't seem out of place in a modern corporate finance textbook. The Italian banking houses that financed Henry's deficit spending were themselves examples of medieval financial innovation that rivaled anything available in contemporary markets. The Lombard merchants, who dominated 13th century international banking, had developed complex financial instruments that allowed them to transfer enormous sums across thousands of miles while minimizing currency exchange risks. These banking networks handled transactions worth millions of pounds per year, providing credit services to kings, nobles, and merchants throughout Europe. The annual profits of major Italian banking houses often exceeded the revenues of minor kingdoms, making successful bankers among the wealthiest individuals in medieval society. But the Italian bankers also demonstrate another crucial aspect of medieval wealth that differs fundamentally from modern billionaire fortunes. Medieval wealth was always embedded in personal relationships and political alliances that could change rapidly based on circumstances beyond individual control. When Edward I of England defaulted on his loans to Italian bankers in 1294, he effectively wiped out several major banking houses overnight. The Riccardi family, who had been among the wealthiest merchants in Europe, lost over £100,000 and never recovered their former prominence. This vulnerability to political risk was a constant feature of medieval wealth that modern billionaires rarely face. Contemporary wealthy individuals can diversify their assets across multiple countries and legal systems, reducing their exposure to any single political authority. Medieval merchants and bankers had no such protection. Their wealth was always subject to the whims of kings who could repudiate debts, confiscate assets, or expel entire communities based on political convenience. This risk factor meant that medieval wealth, however large, was always precarious in ways that modern fortunes are not. The precarious nature of medieval wealth becomes even more apparent when we examine what happened to royal fortunes during periods of political instability. The 100 Years' War between England and France provides numerous examples of how quickly enormous royal treasuries could be depleted by military necessity. Edward III of England began the war with a royal treasury containing over £300,000, making him one of the wealthiest kings in European history. But the costs of maintaining armies in France were staggering. A single military campaign could consume £50,000 or more, equivalent to an entire year's royal revenue. Within a decade of beginning the war, Edward had exhausted his inherited wealth and was forced to implement increasingly desperate measures to raise funds. He borrowed heavily from Italian bankers, imposed new taxes on wool exports, and even pawned the crown jewels to finance military operations. The financial strain of the war eventually forced Edward to default on his international loans, creating a banking crisis that spread throughout Europe. Several major Italian banking houses collapsed, and international credit markets didn't fully recover for decades. This financial crisis demonstrates how medieval royal wealth, despite its apparent enormity, could be consumed with shocking rapidity when kings pursued expensive military policies. The scale of medieval warfare was so enormous that even the richest kingdoms could bankrupt themselves within a few years of intensive campaigning. The Battle of Crécy in 1346, which we mentioned earlier, provides a perfect example of both the costs and potential profits of medieval warfare. Edward's army consumed roughly £30,000 in supplies, wages, and equipment during the campaign, but the victory generated over £100,000 in plunder, ransoms, and territorial revenues. This 3-to-1 return on military investment was typical of successful medieval campaigns, explaining why warfare remained an attractive wealth generation strategy for ambitious kings. But it also illustrates the enormous risks involved. A military defeat could wipe out years of accumulated wealth in a single battle. The capture of King John II of France at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356 demonstrates both sides of this equation. The English earned enormous profits from John's ransom, while France faced financial crisis that lasted for decades. The ransom payment of 3 million gold crowns represented roughly 10 years of French royal revenue, forcing successive French kings to implement punitive taxation that sparked numerous rebellions. This financial crisis following John's capture shows how medieval royal wealth was always vulnerable to personal disasters that could affect entire kingdoms. When a king was captured, killed, or deposed, the wealth generation systems he had built could collapse rapidly. Modern billionaires face no comparable personal risks to their fortunes. Even if Jeff Bezos was somehow captured by foreign powers, Amazon would continue operating and generating wealth for its shareholders. The company's value isn't dependent on any single individual's personal safety, but medieval kingdoms were fundamentally personal enterprises that depended entirely on the king's ability to maintain political control. This personal nature of royal wealth created both opportunities and vulnerabilities that don't exist in modern economic systems. The opportunities were enormous because successful kings could make decisions and implement policies with a speed and decisiveness that modern corporations can't match. They didn't need board approval for major investments or shareholder consent for strategic changes. When Alfonso X of Castile decided to invest in his translation project, he could redirect royal resources immediately without consulting anyone. When Henry V of England chose to invade France, he could mobilize the entire kingdom's military and financial resources within months. This decisiveness allowed medieval kings to pursue opportunities that might be lost in the complex decision-making processes of modern organizations. They could respond to changing circumstances with an agility that contemporary institutions often lack. But the personal nature of royal wealth also created vulnerabilities that modern billionaires don't face. Kings couldn't delegate ultimate responsibility for their wealth to professional managers or institutional structures. They had to personally oversee every aspect of wealth generation and preservation. This personal responsibility meant that a king's character traits, decision-making skills, and physical health directly affected the kingdom's economic performance. A wise and energetic king could dramatically increase royal wealth, while a foolish or lazy ruler could squander generations of accumulated treasure. King John of England provides a perfect example of how personal failings could destroy royal wealth. John inherited one of the richest kingdoms in medieval Europe from his brother, Richard the Lionheart. The royal treasury contained over £200,000 and annual revenues exceeded £60,000. But John's poor military judgment, diplomatic failures, and arbitrary taxation policies led to a series of disasters that consumed this inherited wealth within a few years. He lost most of the English territories in France, faced multiple baronial rebellions, and was eventually forced to sign Magna Carta, which limited his ability to raise revenues. By the end of John's reign, the royal treasury was virtually empty, and the kingdom was facing financial crisis. John's personal failures had essentially destroyed one of the largest royal fortunes in medieval history. This vulnerability to personal failure was balanced by the potential for exceptional individuals to create enormous wealth through their personal capabilities. Kings who combined intelligence, ambition, and good fortune could achieve wealth accumulation that exceeded anything possible through institutional means. Frederick II of Sicily represents perhaps the ultimate example of personal genius applied to wealth creation. Frederick inherited a relatively modest kingdom, but his intellectual brilliance and political skill allowed him to build one of the largest fortunes in medieval history. Frederick spoke 9 languages, wrote poetry and scientific treatises, and maintained correspondence with scholars throughout the known world. But he also understood economics, military strategy, and international diplomacy with remarkable sophistication. Frederick's court in Palermo became a center of learning that attracted the best minds from Europe, Africa, and Asia. But this wasn't just intellectual curiosity. Frederick used his scholarly network to gather intelligence about trade routes, natural resources, and political opportunities that he could exploit for economic gain. The information Frederick gathered through his intellectual contacts allowed him to make investment decisions that generated enormous returns. He established trade relationships with distant kingdoms, invested in new agricultural techniques, and developed manufacturing capabilities that produced goods for export throughout the Mediterranean. Frederick's annual income at the height of his power exceeded 800,000 gold augustales, making him one of the wealthiest individuals in the medieval world. But this wealth was entirely the product of his personal capabilities and vision. No institutional system could have achieved comparable results without Frederick's unique combination of intellect and ambition. This personal dimension of medieval wealth creation has no parallel in the modern world. Contemporary billionaires typically build wealth by creating organizations that can operate independently of their personal involvement. Bill Gates can step away from Microsoft, and the company continues generating profits for shareholders. But Frederick's wealth was inseparable from his personal engagement with every aspect of his kingdom's economic activity. When he died in 1250, his sophisticated wealth generation systems collapsed rapidly because no successor possessed his unique capabilities. This collapse demonstrates both the potential and the limitations of personal-based wealth accumulation. Frederick achieved wealth creation on a scale that would be impossible through purely institutional means, but his achievements couldn't survive his death. The contrast between personal and institutional wealth creation becomes even more apparent when we examine the long-term survival rates of medieval royal fortunes compared to modern billionaire wealth. Most medieval royal dynasties lost their wealth within a few generations due to military defeats, succession disputes, or simple mismanagement. But some modern billionaire families have maintained their wealth across multiple generations through sophisticated estate planning, diversified investments, and professional management. The Rothschild family, for example, has preserved enormous wealth for over 2 centuries by creating institutional structures that can operate independently of any single family member's personal capabilities. Medieval kings had no access to such institutional wealth preservation mechanisms. Their fortunes were always vulnerable to personal disasters, political changes, and military defeats that could eliminate generations of accumulation overnight. This vulnerability explains why medieval royal wealth, despite its enormous scale, was often less stable than modern billionaire fortunes. Kings understood that their wealth could disappear rapidly, so they tended to spend it more freely than contemporary wealthy individuals who expect their fortunes to survive for generations. The spending patterns of medieval kings reflect this understanding of wealth's impermanence. When they had money, they used it immediately for projects that would enhance their power, prestige, or personal enjoyment. They couldn't afford to save for the future because the future was always uncertain. Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, provides an excellent example of this spend-it-while-you-have-it mentality. Louis inherited enormous wealth from his predecessors, but he used it immediately for crusading expeditions, cathedral construction, and charitable activities. Louis's spending was so lavish that his administrators sometimes warned him about potential financial problems. But Louis understood that hoarding wealth was pointless if political circumstances could eliminate it at any moment. Better to use royal resources for projects that would enhance his reputation and secure his dynasty's position. Louis's approach to wealth deployment was remarkably sophisticated, despite its apparent profligacy. His crusading expeditions, while expensive, enhanced France's international prestige and created diplomatic relationships that generated long-term economic benefits. His cathedral construction projects stimulated urban development and created employment for thousands of craftsmen. Most importantly, Louis's charitable activities created a reservoir of popular support that protected his dynasty during periods of political instability. French peasants and townspeople remembered Louis's generosity and remained loyal to his successors, even when royal policies became unpopular. This strategic use of wealth to build political capital demonstrates another sophisticated aspect of medieval royal finance that modern observers often overlook. Kings understood that money was only valuable insofar as it could be converted into power, influence, and security. Contemporary billionaires often focus on accumulating wealth for its own sake, measuring success by net worth rather than practical capabilities. Medieval kings measured success by their ability to achieve political objectives, whether that meant conquering territory, building monuments, or securing dynastic succession. This difference in priorities led to fundamentally different approaches to wealth management. Modern billionaires typically try to maximize their financial returns while minimizing risks. Medieval kings were willing to accept enormous risks in pursuit of political goals that might not generate any financial returns. The Crusades provide perhaps the most dramatic example of this willingness to sacrifice wealth for political and religious objectives. European kings spent enormous sums financing military expeditions to the Holy Land that had little chance of generating economic profits. The First Crusade alone cost European kingdoms an estimated 5 million marks of silver, which was roughly equivalent to the combined annual revenues of all participating kingdoms. Most of this wealth was simply consumed by military expenses, with very little tangible return on investment. Yet European kings continued funding crusading expeditions for over 2 centuries, despite their poor economic returns. They understood that crusading enhanced their religious prestige, created opportunities for territorial expansion, and provided outlets for the military ambitions of their nobles. This willingness to sacrifice economic efficiency for political objectives demonstrates another crucial difference between medieval and modern approaches to wealth. Contemporary business leaders are constrained by shareholders, regulators, and market forces that demand consistent financial performance. Medieval kings faced no such constraints. They could pursue projects that made no economic sense if those projects served their political or personal objectives. This freedom allowed them to undertake civilization-shaping initiatives that would be impossible under modern corporate governance structures. The construction of medieval cathedrals illustrates this point perfectly. These buildings required enormous investments that generated no direct financial returns. Yet kings throughout Europe competed to fund the most magnificent cathedral projects, understanding that these monuments would enhance their reputations for centuries. The Cathedral of Chartres, built with substantial royal funding during the 13th century, consumed over 1 million livres during its construction. That was roughly equivalent to 5 years of French royal revenue, invested in a building that would generate no income. But Chartres became one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in medieval Europe, attracting visitors who spent money in French towns and paid taxes to French authorities. The indirect economic benefits of cathedral construction often exceeded the initial investment, but only because medieval kings could take multi-generational approaches to major projects. Modern billionaires occasionally fund large-scale philanthropic projects, but they're constrained by tax regulations and expectations of measurable results. They can't make investments that won't show returns for centuries, because contemporary accounting standards require more immediate justification for major expenditures. This short-term focus of modern wealth management limits the scope of projects that contemporary wealthy individuals can undertake. They can fund scientific research, educational institutions, or charitable activities, but they can't reshape entire civilizations through sustained investment over multiple generations. Medieval kings faced no such limitations. They could pursue projects that wouldn't be completed for centuries, knowing that their successors would continue funding initiatives that served dynastic interests. This long-term perspective allowed them to achieve transformations of human society that no modern individual wealth can accomplish. The university system provides another excellent example of medieval royal investment in civilization-building projects. Kings throughout Europe funded the establishment of universities that would educate clergy, administrators, and professionals for centuries to come. The University of Paris, founded with royal support in the early 13th century, required initial investments of over 50,000 livres for buildings, libraries, and faculty salaries. But this investment created an educational institution that enhanced French intellectual prestige and trained administrators who improved the efficiency of royal government. The long-term economic returns from university investment were enormous. Educated administrators collected taxes more efficiently, negotiated better trade agreements, and developed policies that enhanced royal revenues. The University of Paris essentially paid for itself many times over through the improved performance of graduates who entered royal service. But university funding also demonstrates the civilizational impact of medieval royal wealth. Kings weren't just accumulating money for personal consumption, they were investing in institutions that would advance human knowledge and cultural development for centuries. Modern billionaires sometimes fund educational initiatives, but they typically focus on specific programs or short-term objectives. They can't create entire university systems from scratch, because contemporary educational institutions operate within complex regulatory and accreditation frameworks that limit individual influence. Medieval kings faced no such constraints. They could establish universities, define curricula, and determine educational policies based entirely on their personal vision of what society needed. This authority allowed them to shape the intellectual development of entire civilizations through their educational investments. The impact of medieval royal education funding extended far beyond the kingdoms that provided initial financing. Students from throughout Europe travelled to royal universities, then returned home with knowledge and ideas that influenced development across the continent. The University of Bologna, established with imperial support, became the centre of legal education for medieval Europe. Students trained in Bologna carried Roman law concepts back to their home countries, creating legal systems that influenced European development for centuries. This intellectual influence represents another form of medieval royal wealth that has no modern equivalent. Kings could invest in ideas and educational systems that would shape human thought across multiple civilizations. No contemporary billionaire possesses such comprehensive influence over intellectual development. The printing press provides an interesting comparison point for understanding this difference. When Johannes Gutenberg developed movable type printing in the 15th century, he required financial backing from wealthy investors to fund his experiments and early production. But Gutenberg's investors were private merchants seeking financial returns, not kings pursuing civilizational transformation. The printing press spread rapidly because it was profitable, not because any single authority decided to promote literacy and knowledge dissemination. Medieval kings could have achieved similar results centuries earlier if they had chosen to invest royal resources in developing printing technology. They had the wealth, political authority, and long-term perspective necessary to fund major technological innovations. The fact that printing wasn't developed until the 15th century reflects the different priorities of medieval royal wealth, rather than any lack of capability. Kings focused their resources on military conquest, architectural monuments, and political consolidation, rather than technological innovation. This choice of priorities illustrates another crucial aspect of medieval royal wealth. Kings had virtually unlimited freedom to determine how their resources would be used, without constraint from market forces, regulatory requirements, or shareholder expectations. Contemporary billionaires, despite their enormous wealth, operate within systems that limit their freedom to pursue projects that don't generate measurable returns. They can fund technological research, but they're expected to produce innovations that create economic value within reasonable timeframes. Medieval kings faced no such expectations. They could invest in projects that might not produce results for generations, or might fail entirely without facing criticism from investors or regulators. This freedom allowed them to pursue transformative initiatives that would be impossible under modern wealth management constraints. But this freedom also created risks that modern billionaires don't face. Kings who made poor investment decisions could bankrupt their kingdoms and lose their thrones. There were no safety nets, bailout mechanisms, or bankruptcy protections to cushion the impact of failed royal projects. The career of Louis VII of France illustrates both the potential and the risks of unconstrained royal wealth deployment. Louis inherited enormous resources and used them to fund the Second Crusade, which he believed would enhance French prestige and secure salvation for his soul. The Crusade was a complete disaster. Louis spent over 2 million livres on military expenses, lost most of his army to disease and enemy action, and returned to France with nothing to show for his enormous investment. The financial strain nearly bankrupted the French crown and created political instability that lasted for decades. But Louis's crusading disaster also demonstrates the resilience of medieval royal wealth systems. Despite the enormous losses, French royal revenues recovered within a generation through improved tax collection, territorial expansion, and economic development. This recovery was possible because medieval royal wealth was based on controlling productive assets that continued generating income, regardless of individual policy failures. Louis's crusading losses didn't eliminate French agricultural productivity, urban commerce, or administrative capabilities. Modern billionaires who make comparable investment mistakes often face permanent wealth destruction because their fortunes are based on financial assets that can lose value permanently. Stock prices that crash don't necessarily recover. Companies that fail don't necessarily resurrect. But medieval kingdoms had inherent wealth-generating capabilities that couldn't be permanently destroyed by individual policy failures. Land continued producing agricultural income. Cities continued generating commercial taxes. People continued needing government services that generated fees and revenues. This underlying resilience of medieval royal wealth systems allowed kings to recover from disasters that would permanently impoverish modern billionaires. They could make enormous mistakes and still retain the fundamental assets necessary for wealth regeneration. The resilience of medieval royal wealth becomes even more apparent when we examine kingdoms that survived multiple disasters while maintaining their basic economic capabilities. The Byzantine Empire endured barbarian invasions, plague epidemics, civil wars, and foreign conquests, while continuing to generate enormous wealth for over 1,000 years. This longevity was possible because Byzantine wealth was embedded in geographical advantages, institutional structures, and cultural traditions that couldn't be eliminated by temporary setbacks. Constantinople's position between Europe and Asia created permanent trade advantages that generated wealth regardless of political circumstances. The Byzantine tax system, legal framework, and administrative apparatus continued functioning even during periods of military defeat and territorial loss. These institutions preserved the empire's wealth-generating capabilities and allowed rapid recovery when political stability returned. Modern corporations occasionally achieve comparable longevity, but their survival depends on maintaining competitive advantages in rapidly changing technological and economic environments. They must constantly adapt their business models to remain profitable. Medieval kingdoms like Byzantium could maintain their wealth-generating systems across centuries without fundamental changes, because their advantages were based on permanent geographical and cultural factors rather than temporary technological or market conditions. This stability allowed Byzantine emperors to accumulate wealth across multiple generations without worrying about competitive disruption or technological obsolescence. Their wealth was based on controlling permanent advantages that couldn't be eliminated by innovation or market changes. The permanence of medieval royal wealth advantages created opportunities for compound accumulation that don't exist in modern economic systems. Contemporary billionaires must constantly reinvest their wealth in new ventures to maintain their competitive positions. But medieval kings could allow their wealth to compound naturally through population growth, agricultural development, and commercial expansion, without requiring constant personal attention or strategic innovation. Their kingdoms generated increasing wealth automatically as societies developed and economies expanded. This automatic wealth generation allowed medieval kings to focus their personal attention on political expansion, cultural development, and civilizational projects rather than day-to-day wealth management. They could pursue grand strategic objectives while their underlying wealth systems continued operating independently. The compound effect of this automatic wealth generation was extraordinary over the centuries-long reigns of successful medieval dynasties. The Capetian kings of France increased their kingdom's wealth by over tenfold during their 3-century dynasty, largely through natural economic growth rather than active wealth management. This compound growth was possible because medieval royal wealth was tied to fundamental economic factors that naturally increased over time. Population growth meant more taxpayers. Agricultural development meant higher productivity. Urban growth meant increased commercial activity. Modern billionaire wealth doesn't benefit from such automatic compound growth because it's typically based on owning shares in companies that must compete for market share rather than controlling entire economic systems that grow naturally over time. The difference between owning companies and controlling economic systems represents perhaps the most fundamental distinction between medieval royal wealth and modern billionaire fortunes. Contemporary wealthy individuals own pieces of economic activity, while medieval kings owned the systems that generated economic activity. This distinction becomes crucial when we consider the ultimate question of this entire analysis: would a medieval king be richer than a modern billionaire? The answer depends entirely on how we define wealth and what we consider valuable. If we define wealth purely in terms of financial assets and purchasing power, then modern billionaires clearly have advantages over medieval kings. Contemporary wealthy individuals can buy goods and services that medieval rulers couldn't imagine, from private jets to advanced medical care to global communications systems. But if we define wealth in terms of power, influence, and the ability to shape human civilization, then medieval kings possessed advantages that no modern individual can match. They could redirect the development of entire continents, determine the fate of millions of people, and create institutions that would influence human society for centuries. The question isn't really about money. It's about what kind of wealth we consider most valuable and what we think wealthy individuals should be able to accomplish with their resources. Medieval kings, who controlled the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars in modern terms, also commanded absolute authority over vast territories and populations. They could make decisions that affected the course of human history without consulting anyone or following any rules beyond their own judgment. Modern billionaires, regardless of their net worth, operate within political and legal systems that severely limit their ability to exercise direct authority over other people or reshape social institutions according to their personal vision. This limitation on modern wealth's political power represents perhaps the most significant difference between medieval and contemporary approaches to great fortunes. Medieval kings expected their wealth to translate directly into political authority and social control. Contemporary democratic societies have created institutional barriers that prevent even the wealthiest individuals from converting their financial resources into direct political domination. Billionaires can influence policy through lobbying and campaign contributions, but they can't simply decree that their personal preferences become law. This separation of wealth from political power represents one of the most fundamental transformations in human civilization since medieval times. The development of constitutional government, independent judiciary systems, and democratic institutions has created barriers between economic resources and political authority that didn't exist in medieval society. Medieval kings viewed wealth and political power as inseparable aspects of the same phenomenon. Their gold bought armies, their armies conquered territories, their territories generated more gold. The cycle was self-reinforcing and theoretically unlimited as long as military expansion remained possible. Modern billionaires face legal and institutional constraints that break this cycle. Even unlimited financial resources can't be directly converted into military conquest or territorial control under contemporary international law. The most a modern wealthy individual can achieve is influence through legitimate political processes. This constraint fundamentally alters the nature of great wealth and what it can accomplish. Medieval kings could use their fortunes to reshape entire civilizations through direct action. Modern billionaires must work within existing systems and convince others to support their vision. The practical implications of this difference become apparent when we examine what medieval kings actually accomplished with their wealth compared to what modern billionaires have achieved with theirs. Medieval rulers created new cities, established new countries, built monumental architecture that still dominates skylines today, and founded institutions that continue operating after centuries. Contemporary billionaires have certainly achieved remarkable things. They've funded medical research, established educational institutions, and developed technologies that have improved millions of lives. But their achievements operate within existing social and political frameworks rather than creating entirely new ones. Elon Musk can revolutionize the automobile industry and advance space exploration, but he can't establish his own country or create his own legal system. Jeff Bezos can transform global commerce and fund space research, but he can't conscript armies or impose taxes on populations. Bill Gates can influence global health policy and educational practices, but he must work through existing governments and international organizations rather than exercising direct authority over territories and populations. These limitations on modern billionaire power aren't necessarily negative. Democratic institutions and international law exist precisely to prevent wealthy individuals from exercising the kind of absolute authority that medieval kings possessed. Most people today would consider these constraints beneficial rather than restrictive. But from the perspective of pure wealth analysis, these constraints represent a fundamental reduction in what great fortunes can accomplish compared to medieval times. Modern billionaires are richer in financial terms, but poorer in terms of direct power and authority. This trade-off between financial wealth and political power reflects broader changes in human civilization since medieval times. Societies have become more complex, more interconnected, and more regulated. These changes have created enormous opportunities for wealth creation through technological innovation and global commerce. But they've also eliminated the simple, direct relationship between wealth and power that allowed medieval kings to convert their fortunes directly into civilizational influence. Modern wealth operates within systems rather than controlling systems. The question of whether medieval kings or modern billionaires are truly richer ultimately depends on which aspect of wealth we consider most important. If we value financial assets and consumer goods, modern billionaires clearly have advantages. If we value authority and the ability to shape civilization directly, medieval kings possessed capabilities that no contemporary individual can match. Perhaps the most honest answer is that medieval and modern wealth are so fundamentally different that meaningful comparison is impossible. They represent entirely different approaches to accumulating and deploying great resources within vastly different social and political contexts. What we can say with certainty is that both medieval kings and modern billionaires have demonstrated humanity's remarkable capacity for concentrating enormous resources in individual hands. Whether through conquest and taxation or innovation and investment, human societies have consistently produced individuals whose wealth far exceeds that of ordinary people. The methods change, the social contexts evolve, but the phenomenon of extreme wealth concentration remains constant across different historical periods. This consistency suggests that great fortunes serve important functions in human society, whether we approve of them or not. Medieval royal wealth funded exploration, architectural innovation, artistic patronage, and institutional development that advanced human civilization in countless ways. Modern billionaire wealth continues this tradition through technological research, philanthropic activities, and entrepreneurial ventures that create new possibilities for human flourishing. The specific mechanisms differ dramatically, but the underlying pattern remains the same. Exceptional individuals accumulate exceptional resources and deploy them in ways that influence the development of human society far beyond what would be possible through collective action alone. This pattern suggests that comparing medieval kings to modern billionaires isn't really about determining who had more money. It's about understanding how different historical periods create different opportunities for exceptional individuals to concentrate resources and influence civilizational development. Medieval times created opportunities for direct political control over vast,